7 people gunned down while they slept, and it remains unsolved. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of the 2020 Aguanga shooting. Viewer discretion is advised. Real quick before we get started, please make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel for more true crime stories. Link in the link tree in my bio. I'm not sure if it's pronounced Aguanga or Awanga. I've heard it pronounced 2 different ways. But it is located right here in Southern California. It was September 7th, 2020. Police would be called to this property here. They were notified that there were gunshots fired and several people were dead. When police arrive, they find 7 bodies. All of them had been shot to death. There were many more people who lived on this property, however, most of them were able to escape. These were the 7 individuals who were shot and killed on that particular day. They believe this attack occurred sometime between midnight and 2 o'clock in the morning. This is a very remote property where this occurred, very off the grid, and that was for a reason. And that's because it was at the time an illegal marijuana farm. This would produce sometimes between $1 to up to $5 million in profits. And eventually police would come to the conclusion, or at least their theory, is that this was committed by a local gang from the San Diego area, primarily a Laotian gang there in that area. They have said that they have 3 persons of interest from that gang, but in terms of who those people are, they haven't announced it because they don't have the evidence to say these were the people who committed these murders. The motive was very clear. This was a robbery. But it is also believed that they were targeted. This was specifically a targeted attack. This was not some sort of random chance encounter. These killers came to this property to kill and also to rob. What exactly they may have taken off with or stolen, I'm not 100% sure. So this property is located off Highway 371 outside of Aguanga. And really, there aren't many people who live in this area. So in terms of witnesses, they didn't really have much. I don't know if the people who managed to escape, I know they heard gunshots, but I don't know if any of them truly saw who actually did this. It was very dark. The lights were off. People were sleeping in tents. So they may have just heard the shots and took off. The victims, by the way, were also of Laotian descent. 6 of them were pronounced dead at the scene. 1 of them survived long enough to get to the hospital, but was pronounced deceased a little bit later. But they were not able to communicate any information. This property being this, large, profitable, illegal marijuana farm, obviously that's going to play into why this occurred. But the police there in Riverside County still need the public's help. They recently, I think as of January 2025, held a press conference about it, still asking, we need your help. We need witnesses. We need something. They're also having difficulties because a lot of the evidence they have in terms of documents and whatnot are all written in Laotian. So translating things is taking, quite some time for them. When they searched the property, during this, by the way, they found over 1,000 marijuana plants, several hundred pounds worth of marijuana. I don't know if there was even more there that was taken. Police have not announced the name of this particular gang they think is involved in this murder, just that they are from the San Diego general area. They did say that they were likely driving a mid-sized dark SUV, and there were multiple individuals involved in this shooting. And I want to state this because I know just from experience of seeing comments and other videos I've made, I know what they were doing. They were, it was illegal. They were obviously heavily involved in drugs. That doesn't mean they deserve to be killed. That doesn't mean their families deserved to lose them forever. It's marijuana. I'm just saying, because I've seen comments and videos similar where they deserved it, or no, they didn't. No, they did not. They deserve justice, and their families deserve justice. So if you have any information on the 2020 Aguanga shooting, please call the Riverside Sheriff's Department at 951-955-2777. These 2 individuals are probable murderers, and their identities remain unknown. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Ali Ismail. Viewer discretion is advised. Real quick before I get started, please make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel for more true crime content. Link in the link tree in my bio. Ali Ismail was a very loving and devoted father to 6 kids. At the time of this case, he was 36 years old. At the time, he's living in Arlington, Texas. He is a respected and reputable businessman. He had graduated from Barron High School in Wisconsin in 2005. He then got a 2-year degree from the University of Wisconsin, and then later on a bachelor's degree in business and IT from the University of Texas in Arlington. And between all of that, he was the father to 6 kids. His kids meant the world to him, and he meant the world to them. He was a family man, a good-natured, well-respected guy. But then a stranger, possibly 2 strangers, took him away from his entire family forever. It was February 14th, 2023. This was actually just 1 month away from Ali and his wife's 14th wedding anniversary. Ali began to approach his home in his vehicle. This was sometime around 5 o'clock in the morning. And he was likely going to do his normal routine, get his wife up, get his kids all situated and ready to go for the day. But unfortunately, he never even made it inside. Around that same time, or at that exact same time, these 2 individuals were seen on several CCTV cameras in the neighborhood, and it looked like they were trying to break into cars. This is one image of them trying to get into this vehicle at a different house. Ali, while still parked in front of his home, was confronted by these 2 unknown individuals. They basically ambushed him. Ali was not given a chance to surrender. He was not given a chance to get out of the car. He wasn't given a chance at all. At least 7 gunshots would ring out. 6 of them hit Ali. One of them had struck the house as well. And there is CCTV video footage where you can hear Ali's wife screaming as the gunshots were over and her running to her husband. Meanwhile, the 2 individuals fled the scene and stole nothing. Ali's wallet, all of his belongings were in the car. They didn't take the car. They just shot him and fled. One of his kids had rushed out and saw his dad still clinging to life. But when, by the time an ambulance and rescue arrived, it was too late. Ali would be pronounced deceased. Ali was a very reputable businessman in the area. He was just a normal, good family man. But there are some believe that he was targeted. Arlington police basically believe that this was a robbery that just went wrong. But then why take nothing? And if they saw someone in the car, if their plan was to steal an unoccupied car, why even go after him? That's kind of why the whole, him being targeted thing, that might make sense. The question, though, is who? Who would do this? What was their true motivation? Was this a robbery that went wrong? It's possible. Was this a targeted attack? Also possible. Police, unfortunately, have very little information and very little evidence. And these 2 individuals here are the prime suspects here, but they don't know who they are. Unfortunately, the footage from all the cameras that caught these 2 individuals was taken from so far away that they're incredibly grainy. It's really difficult to really make out any features of these 2 individuals. But maybe these 2 individuals bragged about what they did. Maybe somebody somewhere out there knows the truth about what happened to Ali that day and why him. And maybe you're afraid to come forward because of retaliation. Well, you can always report information anonymously. So you don't have to say who you are, you just have to say what you know. Ali, his kids and his family, his wife, they deserve the answers. So, if you have any information about the murder of Ali Ismail, please call 817-459-5691 or 817-469-8477. A killer would be paroled only to kill 2 more people. Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of Amie and Dierdre. Viewer discretion is advised. It was November 23rd, 1982 in Hanover Township, New Jersey. 18-year-old high school student Amie Hoffmann had been working her job at the mall, and then she would leave after her shift was over. She walked out into the parking lot and seemingly got into her car, but she never got home. Amie described as sweet. She was very popular. She was really, really well liked at school. She was a cheerleader. She was very, very involved at school. She was also very reliable and punctual, and so when she didn't come home and her friends couldn't get a hold of her, they obviously knew something was wrong, and so they would end up reporting Amie missing. They would go to the mall at the parking lot, and they saw Amie's car still there. The door was open. The keys were in the ignition. Her purse was on the passenger seat. Her belongings were all in there, but Amie wasn't. There was no sign of foul play. There was no sign of a struggle, but it was more than obvious that Amie was likely abducted. A short time later in Randolph Township, A body of a young woman was found in a water reservoir tank type thing. It was more than obvious that this girl, a young girl, had been murdered. She was taken to the coroner's office where they determined that she had been strangled to death and she was also sexually assaulted. Even though she was in the water, they actually still found male bodily fluid with her body. The body would soon be identified as 18-year-old Amie Hoffmann. Investigators would question people and witnesses would come forward to state that they didn't necessarily see the actual abduction happen. However, in the mall parking lot around the time the abduction would have occurred, they did see a vehicle speeding away very quickly. They came up with a composite drawing of the vehicle, and they also came up with a composite drawing of what the man behind the wheel looked like. Even though they only got a quick look at him, they were able to give a pretty good description. They put his image out on the news, they put the car image out on the news, but they weren't getting a lot of hits. And then on December 5th, 1982, it happened again. A vehicle was found on the side of the road of Interstate 80, also in the same area of New Jersey. The vehicle was abandoned, but maybe a couple hundred feet down the road, a woman was picked up by a truck driver. This truck driver saw that this woman was clearly in need of help, and so he rushed her to the hospital. This girl had stab wounds on her body, and the hospital did everything they could, but unfortunately, they were not able to save her. She would be pronounced deceased, and she was later identified as 25-year-old Dierdre O'Brien. What they believe happened is that she was driving down the interstate and someone literally got her off the side of the road, either sideswiped her car or convinced her to pull over based on oh, my car's broken down kind of thing. And then she was abducted. Then she was sexually assaulted, because they did have evidence of that as well, and then stabbed to death and just left on the side of the road, where she managed to crawl herself down the road a little bit before she was found. A similar vehicle that was seen with the Amie Hoffmann case was also seen driving down Interstate 80. In January of 1983, so just a couple of weeks later, a man enters the hospital saying he has been stabbed by a woman. This man is James Kadadich. James had brought his car to the hospital where he went to go get himself, looked at. And while police were questioning him about the stabbing he claims he got, they would end up going to his car and they realized this is the exact same car as one described in both of the attacks of the young women, the murders. Near where Amie's car was found, and also I guess on the dirt path where Dierdre was found, they did also find tire impressions. They took those down and then they actually would line them up with the tires of his car and they were a match. So they can say that his car was present at both crime scenes. The hospital would also tell police that the knife wounds weren't very deep on James Kadadich's body. They were actually self-inflicted. He did it to himself. They don't know why though. James didn't have an alibi for either murder. He just said, I was driving around those nights. Okay, well that's not very helpful. But based on circumstantial evidence, they would arrest him and charge him with both murders. James was originally born in New Jersey, but at one point he would end up living in Florida, where he would commit a series of burglaries. He had been arrested a few times. He had gone to prison for burglary. In 1973, he had worked with a man named Robert J. Anderson, I guess worked with him during one of these robberies. And while I guess James Kadadich was waiting for an arraignment or some kind of trial, he would end up going back to Robert J. Anderson and strangling him to death. And so James was caught for that and convicted of a second-degree murder. And he only got a 15-year prison sentence. While in prison, he fatally stabbed another inmate, claiming it was self-defense, so he was never actually charged with that killing. James Kadadich was paroled after about 11 years in prison, which put him out in 1982 or so, and he committed 2 more murders. Even though the evidence against him was very circumstantial, they did not have DNA testing back then, even though they had male bodily fluid, and he was convicted and sentenced to death. But not too soon after that, his conviction or the death penalty was overturned, and he was resentenced to life in prison without parole. I do know that he had been working with the Innocence Project at some point, or he contacted them at some point. He basically wants that DNA tested in order to clear his name, but it doesn't sound like they've actually done that yet. So I don't know what's going on in that regard. And it's kind of like, he had killed before, he had been a criminal before, but he had never killed or attacked women before, and so this was something new. And so yeah, testing that DNA would help really say, okay, it was definitely him, or oops, it wasn't him. I don't know why these things aren't just tested. Just why do you have to even ask for it or beg for it Just do it. Like, test the DNA. Make sure you're right, you know? As far as right now, I'm filming this in February 2025. There has been no updates in that regard. But hopefully, Amie and Dierdre, hopefully, got the justice they both rightfully deserved. Domestic violence is not something that only happens in adult relationships. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Amie Carnevale. Viewer discretion is advised. Real quick before we get started, please make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel for more true crime stories. The link is in the link tree in my bio. Amie Carnevale was born on April 13th, 1977, and she lived in the Danvers area of Massachusetts for most of her life, which, unfortunately, her life was only 14 years. Everyone described Amie as sweet, caring, loving. She was incredibly kind, very thoughtful. She always seemed to have a very, upbeat attitude, seemed to always be happy. She attended Beverly High School in Beverly, Massachusetts, where she was also a cheerleader, and she was popular. She had a lot of friends. And one day, Amie hoped to become a hairstylist, but unfortunately, that would never come to reality. At the time, she was dating this 16-year-old named Jamie Fuller. Jamie was he was a piece of shit. He was incredibly mean. He was physically and emotionally abusive. He had a previous relationship where he had abused his girlfriend, and the relationship he had with Amie seemed to be tumultuous. He was always incredibly jealous of everything she did. He would yell at her about hanging out with friends. He had been seen numerous times grabbing her by the arm and just yanking her towards his direction. He actually told his friends and other people that he said, one day I think I might have to just kill Amie. People heard this. No one did anything. No one took him seriously. He considered Amie to basically be his, like he owned her. Everybody saw this, but nobody did anything about it. And then it was too late. A couple of days before all of this happens, Amie attends a little beach gathering with some of her friends. Jamie found out and he was livid. He said, quote, "I'm getting sick of this. I swear I'm going to kill her. This shit's got to stop. She won't be around to go out with anyone anymore. I'm going to fucking kill her." End quote. On August 23rd, 1991, Jamie lures her out of her home under the guise of wanting a haircut. She wants to be a hairstylist, she's good at it, and so she takes the bait. Jamie, along with two of his friends, pick Amie up. They drive to a secluded location. You see, Jamie had told his friends, these two kids, that I'm going to kill her, and I'm going to do it now. The two friends told Jamie, you don't have the balls to do it. Jamie responds with, you'll see. So they get to the secluded location. Jamie takes Amie and takes her into the woods while the two friends stay behind. Jamie covers her mouth from behind, says, "I love you, Amie," and then takes a knife and he jams it into her stomach. He pushed the knife in so deep that later he says he could feel her abdomen being ripped open. She bit his hand and she tried to run away, but he grabbed her by her hair and he yanked her back onto the ground. And then while on the ground, he takes a knife and he slits her throat. He would later say that Amie began to choke on her blood and that, quote, pissed me off. So he then stomped on her until she stopped. He then casually walks back to his two friends holding a bloody knife that had a bent tip and looked them right in the eyes and said, "It's done." Jamie and these two kids go back to one of their homes and he allegedly threatens them both and says, if you say anything to anybody, I'm going to do the same exact thing to you. If you don't help me hide her body, I'm going to kill you both. So they agreed and they helped tie cinder blocks to Amie's body to dump her and hide her. But a few days after this, one of the friends goes to police and says, this is what happened and I'm going to show you where she is. And they found her. She had been absolutely brutalized. Jamie Fuller is then arrested and charged with her murder. I don't know exactly what happened to the two friends, but from what I do understand, I believe they both testified against Jamie. Jamie is convicted and he is found guilty of the murder. There was no disputing the fact that he actually did it. It sounds like even his own lawyers were like, all right, he did it, but it wasn't premeditated. Yeah, no, that's bullshit. And nobody believed that. He planned this. He told people he was going to kill her. Nobody intervened. Nobody stopped him. I don't think Amie's family knew about any of these threats and stuff because, again, nobody said anything. But he would be convicted and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. However, he has gone to parole hearings, I believe at least a couple of them, and Jamie Fuller has been repeatedly denied parole. That is a disgusting, vile, horrific human being, if you can even call him a human. This is a monster. This is not someone who should ever be let out. But thankfully, he is behind bars, he is being denied parole, and Amie Carnevale got the justice she very rightfully deserved. Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of Bertha Altamirano. Viewer discretion is advised. So this case occurred in Phoenix, Arizona, which is in my neck of the woods. But unfortunately, I don't have a lot of information. It always boggles me when there's like an unsolved murder where there is very little published about it. All I really know is that Bertha Altamirano was 58 years old. She was disabled. She was a wife and she was a mother. And on November 19th, 2004, her life came to a very sudden end. They lived here on Maldonado Drive in Phoenix, Arizona. On November 19th, 2004, Bertha's husband would leave the house and go to a doctor's appointment. He left the house at 6:40 a.m. He returned to the house at 11:40 a.m. When he left, Bertha was alive and well. When he got home, his wife had been murdered. I do not know her cause of death, but the police have ruled this a homicide. I don't know if anything was stolen. I don't know if there was any forced entry into the home. I don't know if they've investigated the husband. I have to assume they did and they confirmed his alibi, but I can't confirm that in the video. Bertha had suffered a stroke, I guess, a few years prior, and so she was really unable to move around freely. She certainly would not be able to defend herself in any kind of attack. Bertha almost never left the house. She was certainly someone who was just staying inside. But did she have enemies? I don't know. Was this a random robbery that went wrong? I don't know. And if it's frustrating for, say, someone like me trying to tell these stories, I have to imagine, I can't even imagine actually how frustrating it has to be for the family. But this happened a little over 20 years ago and police still have nothing. They have not, to my knowledge, announced they ever had a suspect or even a person of interest. I don't know if they have any kind of DNA or any kind of physical evidence, but it doesn't hurt to at least put her image out there with her name, and maybe someone will see this and it will jog their memory, because she still deserves justice. She hasn't gotten it yet. And somebody somewhere out there has got to know the truth, and perhaps that someone is you. If you have any information on the murder of Bertha Altamirano from Phoenix, Arizona, please call 480-948-6377 or 1-800-343-TIPS. You can report information anonymously. If her killer is still out there and you know who it is, please help bring them to justice.
In his own blood. Your time is up, Counsel. Thank you.
Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of Bill Mowbray. Viewer discretion is advised. In the late evening hours of September 16th, 1987, this woman here, Susie Mowbray, calls 911. Her husband has just been shot. Police arrive and they find Bill Mowbray lying in his bed in a pool of blood. He had been shot through the right side of his head. The gun that was used was lying next to his body. Bill Mowbray was rushed to the hospital, but unfortunately they were not able to save him. He would be pronounced deceased. Bill and Susie Mowbray had been married for quite some time. They had kids together, and Bill was a one-time successful car salesman at a Cadillac dealership there in Brownsville, Texas, where they lived. The marriage was not without its problems. Bill had been unfaithful to Susie, and there were allegedly money issues happening. And Bill was, according to Susie, struggling emotionally. She would tell police that Bill had threatened to end his own life numerous times. As a matter of fact, he made an attempt on his own life sometime prior to this, and that he just was not well mentally anymore. Susie says that while they were lying in bed, she wakes up and all of a sudden she sees Bill's arm go up like this, and then she hears a loud pop. Bill, according to Susie, had just shot himself. Susie, for some reason, first calls an associate of Bill's, and this person says, "Call 911, what are you doing?" And so she does. At first, to police, this did look like a suicide. One thing that blood spatter experts would later testify in is that when a person fires a gun at close range at a person, there's going to be a lot of blowback, brain matter and blood. And so whoever fired the bullet should have had that kind of blood matter and brain matter on their arm. According to police and paramedics, Bill Mowbray had no blood spatter on his right arm, which had to have been the one that he used to pull the trigger if this was something he did to himself. Not one speck of blood, apparently. They know it was his right hand that he used to pull the trigger because his left hand had the exit wound. Basically, his left hand he had been like laying on it, maybe with a pillow on top of it, and then the bullet went through that way and it pierced his hand. Then police began to look at Susie's behavior. Within a day, she started cleaning up the bedroom. She started repainting it. She took everything out of it. She was cleaning linens and stuff. Now, the reason she gave was that the police confirmed that, initially this was a suicide. And so the police did not process the crime scene as a murder scene. And because she was under the impression that they were treating this like something he did to himself, she thought she could clean up everything. And apparently she seemed kind of cold and disconnected from all of this, which is not unusual. I mean, people react in very different ways to these things. So there would be two different experts who would analyze all the blood spatter found in this crime scene. One expert testified that they found numerous microscopic, tiny little specks of blood on Susie's nightgown, which would have been blowback onto her if she fired the gun from close range. And this was done through luminol testing. I know they tested Bill for gunshot residue, but I don't know what the result was. I don't really see any indications of what results for anyone's gunshot residue was. But the expert said, well, Susie had to have pulled the trigger because she had blood spatter on her nightgown. The fact that Bill did not have any blowback on his right arm, which would have been the one he used to pull the trigger, means he could not have done it. Well, there was a second blood spatter expert who also looked at the nightgown and said that the blood specks found on the nightgown were probably not even blood at all. Luminol testing doesn't just only show blood, it can show other substances as well. This other expert, analyzed this. He could not find any actual bloodstains on this nightgown. The other expert said it was there, but the other guy was like, no, it isn't. Susie Mowbray was then arrested and charged with the murder of her husband. The motive, they stated, financial. But she never received a single penny. They did have evidence that she had inquired about the life insurance policy a few weeks before Bill's death, and they looked at that as very suspicious, which, I would agree. He'd also been unfaithful to her. That's another potential motive. But Susie swears up and down she didn't do this. He was suicidal. He had attempted it before. He had threatened it numerous times. And that's what happened here. But at the trial, they presented the expert who stated that there was blood on the nightgown. The report from the other expert that there wasn't blood on the nightgown was never handed over to the defense team until about 2 weeks before the trial. And the prosecution never called that witness to testify that there was not blood on that nightgown. They withheld it. Susie Mowbray would be found guilty of the murder of her husband and sentenced to life in prison. But then there were reports that came out that the prosecution withheld the findings of the other blood spatter expert, that it was impossible for Susie to have pulled that trigger, that there was no blood spatter on her body or on her nightgown. So the courts agreed and ordered a new trial for her. Her second trial starts in January of 1998. This time they admit the evidence that had from the other expert that states that there was no blood spatter on that nightgown. The actual experts who did testify during her initial trial would take the stand and say, yeah, we weren't basing our information on any kind of scientific basis. Basically, they admitted that they were probably wrong. They testified under oath that the forensic process they used to test that nightgown and other aspects of this case were extremely flawed. But the prosecution is still saying she's the only one who could have done this. During the closing arguments, Susie does this.
When she's standing outside with her drink in her hand, when she's medicating herself, he is still alive, gaggling in his own blood. Your time is up, counsel. Thank you.
Some think it was a very real reaction. Some people say it was an act. But this time, the jury deliberates and comes back with a verdict, and they find Susie Mowbray not guilty of the murder of her husband, Bill. The jury would actually, or a jury member would actually do something very unprecedented. They would come out and they would basically make an announcement to the media that their decision was not based on whether or not they felt Susie was innocent or guilty. That their decision was based on the fact that the prosecution was not able to prove their case against her. That they really had no opinion either way if she actually did it or not. Which, that's how it's supposed to work, right? The prosecution has to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. And the jury in this case felt that they were not able to do that. So, by law, you cannot convict someone. One of the biggest issues in this entire thing is how come if Bill did it with his right hand, why did he not have any blood on his right arm from blowback? His right arm was found underneath the covers when the ambulance arrived. Susie could have done that without thinking, who knows? There is still a lot of mystery behind this, because that would indicate that he couldn't have done it to himself. If his arm was under the covers and Susie hadn't done that, and there was no blood spatter on his arm, then who did it? Well, some experts are saying scientifically Susie couldn't have done it, and also Bill couldn't have done it. Someone did. Someone shot this man. And Susie can never go on trial again because she was acquitted, double jeopardy. And in the end, the death of Bill Mowbray remains a mystery. He leaves work to meet a friend and he is never seen again. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Brad Brisbin. Viewer discretion is advised. Real quick before we get started, please make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel for more true crime stories. The link is in the link tree in my bio. At the time of this case, Brad Brisbin was a 38-year-old married father living in the Yellowstone part of Montana. He and his wife, Renee, owned a little restaurant there, and they were a very, very happy couple. Brad was a former canine deputy with the sheriff's department. But now he owns a restaurant with his wife, and also he is a gym teacher at the local high school. Brad was described as fun-loving. He enjoyed life. He was an incredibly loyal person, very trustworthy. He was honest, and he would do anything for anyone if they needed help. He also loved having fun. He liked to pull practical jokes and pranks on people. Who doesn't? On Friday, November 9th, 1990, Brad is at work at the high school when he receives a phone call, and he abruptly needs to leave his work, which is extremely rare for him. He never really did that. He said he talked to a friend on the phone. The friend needed help immediately, and so he had to leave. He was meeting this man here, a friend of his named Larry Moore, and he was going to be meeting him in Belgrade, Montana, roughly 90 miles away. The two of them would meet at this diner. Then Brad left, and he was never seen alive ever again, and he would be reported missing by his family. Larry Moore would later tell police that he, in fact, met Brad at that diner. They had a conversation. Larry lent Brad some money, and Larry said Brad was drunk. He was depressed. He was tired of his wife. He was tired of his life, and he was tired of owning the restaurant. He wanted out. Larry then says after Brad leaves the restaurant, he sees Brad get into a red vehicle, this is a recreation, with Washington plates. This got into the passenger side, and then the car drove away. After he is reported missing, police go to the restaurant where he was last seen, the diner, and they find Brad's vehicle. No signs of foul play in the vehicle. Nothing stolen. Larry Moore is married to this woman here, Shelley. Shelley works with Brad at the high school. She's also a teacher there. There were rumors that Larry believed that Brad and his wife Shelley were having an affair. Shelley denied it outright, and Brad's wife said, no, that's not possible. The only person who said it and believed it was Larry. 2 days before Brad would disappear, Larry and Shelley separated. And Shelley, when talked to by police after Brad's disappearance, would say that she believes that Larry had something to do with whatever happened to Brad. Larry was abusive towards her physically. He was an incredibly jealous person, and he truly believed that she was having an affair with his friend Brad. A few weeks later, police receive a typed-out note claiming to be from Brad Brisbin, saying he was starting a new life. Larry Moore says around that same time he also got a typed-out letter from Brad, and it was signed by Brad. However, handwriting experts would later determine that the signature Brad Brisbin put here was not Brad's. It was forged. Police are now very suspicious of Larry, and so they are granted warrants to do searches. They search Larry's truck, and then they search Larry's camper. In the camper, they find numerous spots where a gun had fired towards. There were bullet holes in the camper, several of them all over the place. And, they also found spent bullets in it. And on a curtain in the camper, they find something more. this human tissue. And that's not all. When searching underneath the carpeting of the camper, they find more blood. There is blood spatter underneath it, and there's blood spatter on a wall. Using the DNA from Brad's children, they're able to determine that the blood found in that camper, in fact, belonged to Brad Brisbin. And the tissue they found actually came from his brain. It was brain tissue. So they can now tell with certainty that Brad Brisbin is dead. They just don't have his body. But it is enough for them to officially arrest Larry Moore, since the blood and all that was found in his camper. The gun was not found at that time either. He denied having anything to do with the murder. However, he goes on trial, and the physical evidence against him is pretty compelling. The motive is compelling. The jury agrees and finds him guilty, and they convict him, and he is sentenced to 60 years in prison. But then in prison, 2 years later, he is caught conspiring to build a bomb in the prison. And in order to avoid federal charges, he finally agrees to show police where Brad's body was. First, he takes him to this wooded area where he says he buried the gun. They dig up the spot, and sure enough, they find the gun. They later confirm it was the murder weapon. He then takes them to the location where he says he buried the body, and they find him. They find Brad. They can confirm with his skeletal remains that he, in fact, died of multiple gunshot wounds. Then, Larry Moore actually reaches out to the show Forensic Files and gives them a confession. He tells them at that point, finally, after all of these years, he was the one to kill Brad. Brad was killed out of jealousy. It was a jealous rage. Larry incorrectly assumed that he was having an affair with his wife, Shelley. He wasn't. They believe he lured Brad out to that diner because he knew Brad was the type of person who would help anyone. He took advantage of that. And then somehow, some way, he lured Brad into his camper where he shot and killed him. Larry Moore tried to get paroled several times, but failed. But then finally, in 2020, after serving roughly 28 years in prison, Larry Moore was paroled. He was 73 years old at the time of his parole. Brad Brisbin's killer is now out. He roams the streets a free man after he premeditated the murder of Brad. There never should have been a chance for parole, in my opinion, but what do I know? In the evening hours of May 10th, 2001, a massacre would occur just above a popular New York delicatessen. Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of the Carnegie Deli Massacre. Viewer discretion is advised. It was just a few minutes after 7:30 p.m. on that May 10th, 2001 evening. NYPD is called to an apartment building that is located just above the very popular and beloved Carnegie Deli, which was located in Manhattan, New York. A man named Anthony had called 911 to state that basically he and his friends had just been shot or shot at. The shooters had left the building and he was able to free himself from the restraints they put him in. When police arrive, they approach the stairwell and they find a woman just covered in blood, and she's alive, but she is just in complete and utter shock and terror. And that was a woman named Rosamond Dane. She had been in the apartment when this massacre occurred. Her hands were still duct taped behind her back. When they enter the apartment cautiously, NYPD does discover Anthony, the one who had called 911, he was still in there, and there were two other men. One was named Stephen King, not the Stephen King, a different one, and Charles Trey Hellowell. Both of those men were found duct taped, they were bound, and they had been shot to death. As the police venture further into the apartment, there is this little makeshift studio they have in there, and when they go inside, they find another person on the ground covered in blood. It was a 39-year-old named Jennifer Stahl. She was actually the one who was renting this apartment. She was alive, but she was barely breathing. So she is rushed to the hospital, but unfortunately, they are not able to save her, and she would be pronounced deceased. 3 murders occurred inside this apartment. 2 more people had been attacked or shot in some way, but they did end up surviving. Jennifer Stahl was actually an actress or an aspiring actress. She had a very small part in the movie Dirty Dancing. She was an excellent dancer. She was a good actress, and she was in New York to hopefully make it big. And she was going to be getting there, but she also, to make ends meet, because when you're trying to make it big in New York or in Hollywood, for example, you have to do some other job, right? And some people will do waitressing jobs, some people will, that kind of thing. And a lot of people end up in the drug world. And Jennifer Stahl was dealing, but it was primarily just marijuana. Jennifer Stahl, it seemed like she may have been the ultimate target in this attack, but the police weren't sure. But they did think that this had something to do with the drugs. You know, was this a drug deal that went wrong? Was this just a good old-fashioned robbery? Jennifer had a wide array of clientele who would come to that apartment to purchase from her. Unfortunately, the two surviving witnesses were not really able to talk to police because they were still in recovery. So they had to rely on other investigative tools. So they did find that the apartment building in the Carnegie Hall Deli itself, they had cameras in there, and they found a camera in a stairwell where you see two men very calmly and casually walk up the stairs, and this would have been the time frame about 7:26 p.m., I believe, which also tracks with the people who worked at Carnegie Deli. They also saw two African-American men who had just very calmly and walked up the stairs towards Jennifer's apartment. Other witnesses would state they saw a car parked very close to the deli and that they'd seen people get into that sometime around the murder, and the car sped away. Eventually, one of the surviving victims was able to inform police that, I guess, someone named Sean had been buzzed up to the apartment that day. That's what they remember. One of the guys' names was Sean. And when interviewing Jennifer's friends and family, that name sounded familiar to them too. It was a man named Sean Sally, someone who had purchased stuff from Jennifer before, but that was their connection. I mean, Jennifer knew Sean Sally, and they had fingerprints from the crime scene. They had fingerprints specifically on the duct tape found with the victims. They were pretty clear fingerprints, and they were able to quickly identify the fingerprints on the duct tape as to being the fingerprints of Sean Sally, because they were able to get his prints. They then find out that Sean Sally was acquaintances or friends with a guy named Andre Smith. Andre Smith drove a vehicle that looked almost identical to the vehicle that had been seen speeding away from the apartment, according to many witnesses. And so now they can place, in all likelihood, Andre Smith in the vicinity of the apartment building, and they also have Sean Sally directly in the apartment with his fingerprints. So Andre Smith is the one who first comes in to talk to police, and he does so on his own accord. He ends up telling police that it was Sean Sally's idea that they were planning to rob these people, and that Andre was just there to help with the robbery. There was no plans for murder. He then says that at some point during all of this, something went wrong, and he heard, Andre Smith said he heard a gunshot, and when he checked, it was Jennifer Stahl. She had been shot by Sean Sally. And then he says he witnessed Sean Sally shoot the other victims because, well, they had just seen what happened. And they went to go see if they could find Sean Sally in his apartment, but he was not there. However, they did find marijuana in his apartment that they could confirm came from the same stash from Jennifer Stahl's apartment. And at that point, Mr. Sally was on the run, and they would air this story on America's Most Wanted. It airs in July of 2001, and within like moments of the show airing, they actually get flooded with phone calls that they believe that Sean Sally is in Florida. And lo and behold, they're able to apprehend him in Florida. Sean Sally is now telling police that it was Andre Smith's idea. This was all his doing. He was the one who committed the actual murders. And so he would say that Jennifer Stahl was shot accidentally. Therefore, all the other people in the apartment need to be shot because of what they saw. The problem police had is that they could not prove which one of them physically shot and killed which victim. They had no way of knowing. They have two guys who are telling the opposite stories, blaming each other, both putting themselves in the apartment and admitting they were there. You have fingerprints in the crime scene that matches one of the suspects. So there's no doubt that these two men were the ones to do this, but they could not show to a jury who actually pulled the trigger. There were two separate trials that were done, and because the prosecution was unable to prove that this was, one, premeditated, and two, that this was, or who pulled the trigger, both men would be convicted, but they were only convicted of second-degree murder. Each one of them was given a 25-year sentence for each murder. So that would be 3 total murders. So they were given 75 years in prison apiece. And at this point, they are still obviously in jail, and the likelihood is that they will really probably never see or breathe free air ever again. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and it led to his murder. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Charles Dowell. Viewer discretion is advised. Charles Dowell was born on November 30th, 1978, and he lived in Ohio his entire life. At the time of this case, he is 18 years old. He had just graduated from high school. He was working a warehouse job, and on his free time, he loved to go fishing. His siblings would call him basically like their father figure because I guess their dad had left them early on. And so he was there to help step in and take care of his brother and his sister. And unfortunately, on April 2nd, 1997, his path would cross with this man. This is Alva Campbell Jr. Ugh. So in 1967, he is arrested and convicted of a series of burglaries, and this was in Ohio. He also shot an Ohio police officer who did survive. Alva was 16 years old at the time, but he was tried as an adult. He was paroled in 1972. When he promptly commits another burglary, he robs a tavern, and while doing that, he murdered a bartender in the tavern, a man named William Dowell. He was arrested for this murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. He was paroled in 1992. Then in 1997, he commits another series of burglaries, and he is arrested once again, which takes us to April 2nd, 1997. He was scheduled for an arraignment for those burglary charges. Somehow, some way, he manages to convince them that he is suffering from paralysis, and they put him in a wheelchair. This is an image of that day. That's him over there in the wheelchair. That's a closer image of it. But obviously, he was faking. Again, how did he get away? I don't know how he got away with that. Jesus, tits. He looks like the Timu version of Henry Lee Lucas. Anyway. Well, whilst being wheelchaired into the courthouse, he steals the deputy's gun. He then holds the deputy at gunpoint and manages to escape the courthouse. And unfortunately, Charles Dowell was there in his pickup truck. He had just pulled up to the area just right at that time. And unfortunately, he was chosen by Alva Campbell. Alva Campbell pointed his gun at him in the truck and carjacked him. He forced this 18-year-old kid to drive, just continue driving for hours. On the radio, they were hearing the story about an escaped convict, that he was on the run. Charles would ask him, "Is that about you?" After about 3 hours, Alva told Charles to get down onto the floor of the vehicle. Charles reportedly, this is according to Alva, that's the only word we have, he refused to cooperate. And that prompted Alva to fire the gun into Charles. He shot him twice, killing him instantly. And then he fled the scene. Police would discover the deceased body inside the truck a short time later. Based on camera footage from the courthouse and basically witness accounts, they were able to piece together that this was Alva Campbell who did this horrible thing, once again committing another murder. Meanwhile, Alva Campbell is out there trying to find another victim, to carjack someone else. He comes across a woman who he points the gun at, but somehow fails at kidnapping her, but does steal her wallet and her car. Then he drove to a nearby shopping center. Now, at this point, his image is all over the news. A police officer spots him in a parking lot, and they begin to pursue him. He gets into the car and a chase ensues. Then at a certain point, he gets out of the truck and begins to run, on foot. When finally, now many officers are involved, they're able to corner him in this neighborhood, and he is arrested with incident, obviously. He would then soon make a videotaped confession to the murder of Charles Dowell. And he was charged with a slew of charges, including escape, murder, robbery, assault. He was convicted, and he was sentenced to death. His first execution date was set for November 15th, 2017, but I guess due to health issues, they were not able to execute him. Then they rescheduled it for June 5th, 2019. At that point, he looks like a turtle. His doctors would tell prison officials that they needed to put him in certain conditions to execute him. Due to his illnesses, they needed to have him with an angled pillow for his breathing to be, better. He needed to be propped at an angle while they were killing him. However, it would never come to that, because on March 3rd, 2018, roughly a year before he was scheduled to be executed, he dies in prison of natural causes. Charles Dowell was just at the wrong place at the wrong time. And this young kid that everybody loved, everybody got along with, this incredible big brother, his life was taken by a coward. But in the end, he did get the justice he rightfully deserved. A house on fire, a body inside. Who would do this to such a beloved person? Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Charles Jack Lynch. Viewer discretion is advised. Charles Lynch, who would go by Jack to everyone, was considered a lifelong bachelor. Jack grew up in a big family, and he was raised to be a really kind-hearted individual. If you were his neighbor, you were his family. That's just how it was with him. To give you an example of that, he had a neighbor whose daughter was, about to graduate high school, but they didn't have they couldn't afford to get her like a graduation dress. Jack paid for it. Jack took care of this neighbor, and it was not the only occurrence of him doing something like that. Jack also served in World War II. He was a corporal in the U.S. Army. Nobody had any beef with him. Everybody loved him. So how on earth did he die in such a brutal way? It was July 16th, 1992. A neighbor of Jack's noticed a small fire had started in his home, which quickly grew into a large fire. Fire and rescue arrive, and it takes them a very long time to get this fire out. But eventually they do, and when they enter the home, they find Jack. His body was severely burned, and he was deceased. The coroner would later determine that it was not just the fire that killed him. He had not one, not two, but 24 stab wounds. And they determined, based on the size of the wounds, that they were done with 2 different knives, which suggested there were 2 killers. However, the knives were not found at the crime scene. What they did notice, however, in the kitchen was a knife block that was missing 2 large knives. So the killers took the knives from his own home. They also found a charred rope right next to his body, and so it looked to police that he had been tied up before he was killed. Missing from the home, specifically in the garage, was Jack's vehicle. They also noticed a VCR was missing, a Sega Genesis was missing, so this was clearly a robbery that ended up in a murder. They also would learn that a .357 Magnum that Jack owned was also missing. However, it was not used in the crime. They also determined that this was clearly an arson. There were 3 separate places where the fire had started, so they knew that this was no accident. Now it's a matter of finding out who did this. Surprisingly, it wouldn't take that long. There was a neighbor at one point that was considered a suspect, because I guess he had some very odd behavior. I guess he was demanding to be let into Jack's house. He was trying to involve himself, but ultimately they determined that this guy had nothing to do with what happened. Around the time of Jack's murder, there were also a string of other thefts that occurred in the surrounding neighborhood. A drugstore had also been robbed, a bunch of prescription drugs had been stolen, and a local hotel had been robbed of cash. Just hours after the murder of Jack, these 2 individuals were pulled over for something completely unrelated. This was Jamie Moore and Robert Moore, a married couple. Well, when they were pulled over in the van, the police found a .357 Magnum, later identified as the exact gun that was stolen from Jack Lynch's home. They also found a bag full of cash. This led them back to the cash that was stolen from that local hotel. So they get a warrant to search the home of Jamie and Robert Moore, and they find a treasure trove. They find a Sega Genesis had been hooked up to their TV. A Sega Genesis had been stolen from Jack Lynch's home. But the coup de grace was they found not 1 but 2 knives hiding behind their mattress or under their bed. There was blood on both knives. The blood on both knives would come back to matching Jack Lynch. They were also an identical fit and a match to the knives taken from the woodblock in Jack's home. When police asked Robert Moore, hey, how'd you get this gun, by the way? He said just plainly, oh, I stole it. I took it when I killed that guy. Okay, well, there's a confession for you. He ends up admitting that he went into Jack Lynch's home and killed him. His wife, Jamie, he says, was not involved in the murder. She did not take place in the crime at all. Police are having a hard time believing that, though. Because, again, there were 2 different knives used in this murder. It didn't make much sense for one person to stab him, more than a couple of times to, okay, he's dead. And they didn't know Jack, so this wasn't a personal attack on him. So 24 times was extremely excessive for someone who just was killing a stranger in the course of a robbery. None of the knives were broken or bent, so why get a second knife? It didn't make sense. However, Robert Moore would confess that he was the only one to be involved in the actual killing. He said he broke into the home, there was no forced entry. Jack basically was there, and so he tied him up, and at one point Jack got out of his bindings and tried to run, and Robert Moore said he stopped him by stabbing him. He then set the house on fire. Jamie did admit to being in the house during the initial portions of the robbery, and she said she left the house when Jack Lynch was tied up and still alive. Police unfortunately just could not prove that they had both used the knives. There was no fingerprints or DNA found on them that matched either of the two individuals. Jamie would end up taking a plea deal, and this is contingent on the fact that she testifies against her husband. So she would plead guilty to armed robbery. Something to note that when she was initially arrested, right before they put the cuffs on her, she tried to swallow a bottle of pills. Then at the police station, when they were trying to fingerprint her, she managed to get something that was glass and break it and try to cut her own wrist. Obviously, those attempts both failed. Jamie would be sentenced to 39 years in prison. Robert Moore would go on trial for the murder, the robbery, etc., and the jury found him guilty of the murder. When deciding his sentence, one juror decided that he did not deserve the death penalty, and so he was not sentenced to death. Instead, he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Was it their stalker? A serial killer? What happened in Cabin 13? Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Cheryl Flippo. Viewer discretion is advised. Cheryl Lynn Jewell was born on January 8th, 1950, and she lived her entire life in West Virginia. She would eventually become a member of the Landmark Baptist Church in West Virginia, where she would eventually meet the pastor, a man named James Flippo. The two of them would start dating, and eventually they got married. By all accounts, at first, it seemed like a really great, happy couple. She fell head over heels for James, and he for her. Cheryl was very, very proud of her faith, and she herself had a large role within the church. It's something that she was so proud to do. At some point in the early to mid-80s, they would find themselves in the midst of a stalker. They received letters with those, cut-out magazine letter type things, saying things like, "I'll get you," "You're next," "I'm watching you." And this terrified Cheryl, understandably so. These letters from the stalker never seemed to be consistent. They came at random times, and there was never any, return address on it, so they had no idea where they were coming from or who's sending them or anything. But life would eventually go on, which takes us to April 30th, 1996. James would book a stay at cabin number 13 at Babcock State Park, just to sort of get away from it all. It's a beautiful state park as well. Very relaxing, very serene. A great place to get away. But it was anything but on that April 30th, 1996 evening. In the early morning hours of April 30th, 1996, James Babcock would use this phone, which was a payphone outside of the lobby of the state park, to say he and his wife had just been attacked in their cabin. He was bleeding and she might be dead. When police finally arrive and they enter the cabin, they find Cheryl on the ground next to the bed. Cheryl was deceased. She had been bludgeoned over her head with a log, and there were indications that she may have been stabbed as well. James had what looks like some sort of stab wound in his leg, and he made note to tell police that there was a strange car parked outside their cabin. It wasn't their car. The car they took there, he said, had been stolen. He tells police, "I think it might be the stalker that we've had on again and off again." Everything that James was saying sounded, accurate, sounded true. Until they realized that the wound in his leg was self-inflicted. It also wasn't very deep at all. The car parked outside the cabin belonged to his friend. Turns out he borrowed his friend's car. They didn't take their car to the cabin. And on March 1st, 1996, James took out a $100,000 life insurance policy on Cheryl. Cheryl was aware of it. That kicked in on April 1st, 1996. Less than 30 days later, Cheryl is dead. In their investigating, they realized that James had stolen from the church before. He was greedy. There was one point a church fund set up for a child who was dying, and James stole $12,000 from that fund. They also discovered that he had previously been a pastor at a church that conveniently burned down, and he got the insurance money for it. Everything pointed to James being the one to kill Cheryl. And it turns out James was the stalker. He was sending those letters to Cheryl. He did so every time that Cheryl might be getting closer to finding out he was embezzling from the church. That's why they were sent so sporadically. James was arrested and charged with first-degree murder for killing his wife. The evidence against him, which was largely circumstantial, was still pretty compelling. A jury agreed and found him guilty, and he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. And it is where he rots to this very day. The last time anyone saw him was at the Shell gas station, and that was in August of 2024. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Christopher Newton. Viewer discretion is advised. Christopher Newton was born in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, and he would be the absolute perfect bigger brother to his two siblings. Chris, from a very early age, irradiated happiness and joy. He had the best smile. He was described as fearless, daring, kind and gentle, intelligent. He was a big music lover. One of his biggest passions, especially when he was like a teenager, was playing hockey. He was incredibly talented at it. He also loved skateboarding. He loved to kind of walk on the wild side a bit. He was, a risk taker at times. And being outdoors was really kind of where he felt at his best. Hiking and camping and just being one with nature. Everything in his life was just going so great. And then when he turned 20, his beloved grandma passed away. And that really, really hit him hard. And ever since that point, his mental health seemed to take a very serious dip. And it only seemed to get worse and worse as each year went by. He was seeing things that weren't there. He tried to convince his family that these things were there, but they couldn't see them. His family did absolutely everything in their power to get him help. But since he was over 18 and he was really kind of a very private person at that point, there was only so much they could do. But it was not from lack of trying. They desperately wanted to help him. It's believed that he may have been diagnosed, or had at least, schizophrenia. This would eventually lead him down the path of addiction and then into homelessness. He began to distance himself from his family. And again, they were trying to be there for him. But, sometimes when a person is battling mental health issues like this, I can understand. He was in and out of treatments at different care centers, and he really kind of only ever gave vague information to his family. His family couldn't, the doctors couldn't tell them anything because he was over 18, and that's when the Privacy Act, kicks in. So they weren't really 100% sure what was going on. But he did still keep in contact with them. He would send them texts from time to time, including this picture here. He had actually ended up setting up camp in the woods, I believe near in Nelson, which is in British Columbia, Canada. He was really proud of his little campsite. He was happy and proud to share it. He even made his own little bird bath, which is pretty cool. Again, being out in nature was really where he felt probably at his best, where he felt himself. And then one day, apparently, he leaves his campsite and he comes back, I'm not sure exactly how long later, but he comes back to his campsite had been completely demolished and torn down. And that really, really devastated him. Chris would pop in and out of emergency shelters where he did have access to medical care, but he wouldn't really stay in them long enough. Because again, he was allowed to freely leave whenever he wanted. In August of 2024, Chris, now 33 years old, was last seen at the Shell gas station where he made a purchase of about $30. What he purchased, though, I'm not sure. Ever since that moment, his bank account has not been touched. He had a cell phone, but I don't think he had actual service. But his phone has never been used since that day. Chris has made zero contact with his family since that August 2024. There have been zero sightings of Chris since that August 2024 day. It's normal for Chris to maybe go 2-ish months without having any contact with family, and so they didn't really truly know he was missing. And it wouldn't be until literally just a month ago, January of 2025, when the story of him being missing was finally kind of out there. He had lived such a private life. And so it's not the fault at all of his family because, again, this was normal. But now they want to know where he is. According to some witnesses, I guess he had stated that, maybe one day he would leave the area. And it's possible he did. So I think now what they're hoping is that it's still a pretty new story, that hopefully if his image is out there, people will recognize him and that people can call in and say, hey, I know where he is. His family just wants to make sure, first and foremost, that he is alive and he's safe. Chris might need assistance. He might need help. And so they are hoping that someone somewhere out there knows where Chris is. And perhaps that someone is you. Again, at the time of this case, Chris was 33 years old, brown hair, brown eyes. He had pretty long hair, 5'10", approximately 160 or so pounds. He does have a skateboard tattoo on his left shoulder. So, if you have any information on his whereabouts, please call 250-354-3919 or Crime Stoppers at 1-800-222-8477. His family just wants to know he is safe. So if that's the very least you could do, please let them know. They just want Chris home. Hello, True Crimerer. So I need to make a couple of corrections to the Chris Newton video that I had just posted earlier. It's not letting me edit the video, which is weird because normally I can edit the video. So I'm just going to make this video. It'll be in the comment section. So if you click this comment, you'll go to the original video. So I got some information from Chris's mom through Chris's aunt. So I had said in the video that Chris had been seen in August of 2024 at the gas station. He was actually seen at the gas station in December of 2023. From that point up until August of 2024, they only have unconfirmed sightings of him. So the last confirmed sighting of him was December of 2023 at the gas station. The campsite was in Edmonton, not Nelson. And then I couldn't find any information with regards to like his cell phone situation, but his mom stated that he stopped using his cell phone back in 2022. Regardless, we already know that there is no cell phone with him, at least none that anyone knows about. So again, the last unconfirmed sighting of Chris was in downtown Nelson in British Columbia, Canada. But the last confirmed sighting of him was at the Shell station in December of 2023. I'm going to give you the information number on here just, in case. So if you have any information on the whereabouts of Christopher Newton, please call 1-800-222-8477. You can also submit tips on www.p as in Paul, the number 3, tips.com. So www.p3tips.com. All right. Thank you, guys. Kids being stupid would lead to one of the worst deaths imaginable. Viewer discretion is advised. This story occurred at the Hocking Hills State Park, which is located in Ohio, and it specifically occurred at the Old Man's Cave area. A 44-year-old photographer and mother to 4 was there at the park taking senior pictures for a class of students. She was a wonderful mother, a wonderful wife, and an all-around great human being. She was a very beloved member of the community. So she was down near the Old Man's Cave area and she was taking these photographs. While she was on the ground below, up above on the cliff top, several teenagers were up there messing around and they thought it would be funny if they were to throw a log over the cliff. And so they took a 6-foot-long log that weighed approximately 75 pounds, and while laughing and thinking this is funny, they rolled that log over the cliff. That log, again, 75 pounds, just so happened to land directly on the 44-year-old photographer. She was killed instantly, or at least that's the belief. She was pronounced deceased at the scene, but there were no suspects readily available at that time because the kids who did this had taken off. It would be through a series of text messages and basically people ratting them out where they would finally find out who did this. 2 of the kids involved were 15 and 16 years old. One was named Jordan Buckley, the other was Jordan Churchhouse. And then they would uncover a 3rd suspect, Miranda Spencer, who was 19 years old at the time of the incident. Miranda would basically say that these 2 boys thought it would be funny to roll a log over the cliff. And then within moments, someone ran past them stating that that log landed on someone, that a woman was just crushed. And so all of the teenagers, instead of fessing up to what they did, they fled. And according to Miranda, one of the boys said, quote, "I caught my first body at 17. And then he laughed about it." Miranda said that both of these boys seemed to have no care in the world for what just happened. Why she didn't come forward immediately, I don't know. Eventually, all 3 teenagers were arrested and they were charged with connection to this case. Initially, they had murder charges placed on them, but they would end up all taking plea deals. And they were both sentenced to approximately 3 years in a juvenile detention center. Pretty much was, unfortunately, the toughest sentence they could really give them. Despite the fact that, these boys showed no remorse for the longest time. They were bragging about it at school, selling drugs at school. You just wish they would be sentenced a lot longer. Miranda was given a much lighter sentence. She was sentenced to probation and a 90-day suspended sentence, plus alcohol evaluation and a $500 suspended fine. Meanwhile, a family is without their mother, their wife, their loved one. All because a couple stupid teenagers thought it would be funny to throw a heavy 75-pound log over a cliff. And they got a slap on the wrist. He was supposed to be heading down to Los Angeles from Northern California, but somehow his car ends up across the country. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Dale Eugene Kelley. Viewer discretion is advised. At the time of this case, Dale Kelley is just 21 years old. He lived in the Carmichael, California area, which I guess is somewhere near Sacramento. Dale, at the time, was a student in college, and he was described as a really level-headed, very calm guy. He was raised in a military family, so he was really disciplined, and it also helped him just be a very reliable person. He would meet a girl in high school, and the two of them would become a couple. And then his girlfriend was transferred down to UCLA, but he was staying up in Carmichael. So on May 20th, 1981, Dale was planning to get into his car and drive the 7 or so hour drive down south to visit his girlfriend. According to the girlfriend, Dale called her that morning sometime around 8 o'clock that he was leaving and he was going to be there later that day. It should have taken, like I said, roughly 7 or so hours, but after that time frame passed and he still hadn't gotten to her home, she became worried. The girlfriend would call, I think it was Dale's roommate, and to say, hey, have you seen him? And he said, no, like he should have been down there. There was a possibility Dale had maybe gotten a little sidetracked and went to go visit some friends in a nearby city, but they called those friends and he wasn't there either. And so eventually what would happen is I believe some of his friends would get into their car and they would drive down the path that Dale would have taken on the highways to get to his girlfriend, but they were just hoping they could find something, any kind of sign of him, but they had no luck. And so they would end up reporting him missing to the Sacramento Police Department because that's where he was from. Once the police got involved, they, put his image out there on the news. They also put out the image of his car. It would have been a 1976 Toyota Celica, and it was a bright orange color. This is not the exact one, obviously, but it's a similar vehicle. Several weeks go by, and police in New Orleans, Louisiana, almost all the way across the country, they would reach out to police in Sacramento because they had found a car abandoned out there. And it was a 1976 orange Toyota Celica. And the license plate number would help them trace it back to Dale. In the car, they found no sign, obviously, of Dale, none of his belongings, from what I understand. There was no sign of a struggle, no broken windows or anything like that, no signs of foul play in the car. In the car, they find a book of all about Texas. They find a Texas map book. And they also find a little place card or something for a restaurant or a bar called Pat O'Brien's, which is located in New Orleans in Louisiana. Dale knew absolutely nobody in New Orleans. He had never been there before. They could not find anything in his current life that would have said, okay, maybe he just suddenly went to New Orleans for some reason. They couldn't find any connections at all. He hadn't been in contact with anyone from there. There's no reason for his car to have been all the way out there. It made no sense. There is some belief because, Dale was a pretty laid back, relatively trusting guy that he would have helped someone if they were in need. So there's a possibility that maybe he came across someone who needed help on the side of the road. He offered his help and maybe they abducted him. It was all a ruse. Maybe his car broke down and someone offered to help him, but then it turned out to be a bad person. But the fact of the matter is they had his car. So this was obviously some kind of carjacking scenario. And in whatever capacity it may have been, whatever the scenario that would have made it play out, he was likely abducted somewhere along that drive from Carmichael to Los Angeles and more than likely killed. But there has been no sign of Dale ever since. None whatsoever. In 1981, Dale, like I said, was 21 years old. He was 5'10", 165 pounds. He was a football player in college. And somebody somewhere out there has got to know what happened to him. Someone knows. And perhaps that someone is you. If you have any information on the whereabouts of Dale Eugene Kelley and what may have happened to him, please call 916-874-5467. A man with Alzheimer's walked away from his home and has not been seen since. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of David Moffet. Viewer discretion is advised. At the time this case occurred, David Moffet is 70 years old, and he lives in Levering, Michigan. David had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's and he was medicated for it. A couple of weeks prior to this case occurring, from what it sounds like, David had wandered off and he was missing for about 13 hours or so. He had been asking people for a ride to Rogers City, which is a place that he really had no connection to. And he was telling people he lived in a place called Petoskey, which was not true. But again, David has Alzheimer's, and so at times he can be confused, especially if he is maybe not taking his medication. But at that point, he was recovered and he was brought home safely. But then, on September 29th, 2023, it happens again. At approximately 10 o'clock that morning, David left his house with his beloved dog Stella to take her for a walk. David did not have his cell phone, he did not have his wallet, he did not have any personal belongings with him, which includes his medication. There would be no form of identification on his person either. By 3:30 p.m., he would be reported missing because obviously he had not returned home, neither had his dog. And the Emmett County Sheriff's Office would state, quote, "Given David's condition and the circumstances of his disappearance, there is growing concern for his well-being," end quote. Apparently, a friend of David's saw him that day around 4:30 p.m., and this was on Larks Lake Road, which is in Levering, but that was the last reported, actual visual sighting of David. On October 4th, 2023, so just, I think, 6 days after David's disappearance, his dog Stella returned home. She was alive and well. However, it appears that her pink collar, this one pictured here, and the black leash was not with the dog. David, by the way, I guess he was wearing the green vest you see in that photo. But police were able to kind of retrace the dog's steps, and the dog kind of brought them to a certain area. However, it did not ultimately help them find David. David is still missing to this very day. He has been missing now for over a year. He is believed to be endangered. I know they've checked other local police stations, they've checked hospitals, and he never went to any of them, at least not to their knowledge. It has been over a year now since he vanished, and there is growing concern that something may have happened to him. Not necessarily foul play being involved here, just given the circumstances of everything. Could he have, maybe fallen somewhere, wandered off too far into maybe a wooded area? I know they have searched very thoroughly for him and they have not found him, but he's got to be out there somewhere. There is always hope, of course, that he will be brought home safe and sound, but with it being almost a year and a half later, hope can understandably begin to dwindle. But someone somewhere out there might know the truth. Someone might have seen him, whether it be around the time he disappeared or months later, and maybe they don't know that this is a missing man. So if you have any information about the whereabouts of David Moffet or what may have happened to him, again, he was last seen wearing that green vest, along with brown carpenter pants, a checkered shirt, and a baseball cap. That actually might have been the whole outfit there. And the pink dog collar and leash has not been found either. People have been encouraged to check their trail cam footage if it's saved that far back, or any buildings in the area that he may have wandered to. Maybe you have saved footage. It's a possibility, but if you have any information, please call 231-439-8900. Please help bring David home. It's been nearly 40 years and the whodunit remains unknown. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Ethan Dixon and Kimberly Dowell. Viewer discretion is advised. At the time of this case, Ethan Dixon was a 16-year-old class president at his high school. He was a young man who showed a lot of very great promise. His friends described him as incredibly smart, very charismatic, very loyal, and he was a very good friend to have. He was dating 15-year-old cheerleader at the high school, Kimberly Dowell. Kimberly was an incredibly popular young girl at the school. She was unbelievably friendly. She got fantastic grades in school, and her and Ethan together were just like the perfect couple. Everyone who knew them said that there was not a happier couple around. They were both really good kids who never did anything wrong, never got in trouble, always followed the rules, didn't run with the wrong crowd, and they would have done very, very good things with their lives, but unfortunately, no one will ever know that for sure. It was September 28th, 1985 in Muncie, Indiana. A canine officer at the time named Terry Winters, he was walking his canine, his dog, at the Westside Park. This is him many, many years later pointing out where this all happened. The park usually closed at about 11 o'clock at night, but there was always a couple of cars still parked in the parking lot. It was normal. As he was done with his walk, he puts his dog into the car, and as he begins to drive out of the parking lot, his lights flash on another car, and the lights show that there are two people in this car, but they're not moving, and the car appears to be running. And something about it just caught his eye, and he stopped his car to go check. What he walked up to was a double homicide. The passenger side window of this vehicle had been shot out. There was a young male in the driver's seat. He had been shot through his torso. There was a female in the passenger seat. She had a gunshot through her temple. There was a portable stereo in the back of the vehicle that was playing music. The individuals would soon be identified as 15-year-old Kimberly Dowell and 15-year-old Ethan Dixon. The last two kids you would ever think something like this would ever happen to. Based on the crime scene, it appears that these gunshots came from a very close range. Based on gunshot powder found around Ethan, that this shooter was right on top of them. And whoever did this to the couple, it really seems like whoever did this knew them, or at least knew one of them. It felt very personal, especially if this person walked right up to the car. But they really don't know for sure if that's the case. This still could have been a completely random thing. Nothing was stolen off of them. The radio in the back seat wasn't taken. No one attempted to steal the car. So was this a robbery that just went really, really bad? Or was there another motive? But what on earth would the motive be? I know police at one point would release this composite sketch of a potential suspect. So apparently there were two other cars seen by witnesses in the parking lot around the time these murders would have happened. One was a car, it was a Monte Carlo, and the other car, which I'm not sure exactly what kind of car it was, this was apparently a composite drawing of the person driving that car. Is this person the killer? They don't know. They at one point suspected Kimberly's stepfather. He was literally labeled a suspect for some time, but they would eventually rule him out. But despite them ruling him out, it ruined his life. Because as we all know, court of public opinion, well, people can be really awful. And they just stick to whatever theories they have. And I hate when that kind of thing happens to a person. They also had a suspect who was like, I guess, a crosstown rival, like typical high school shit. But that didn't pan out either. Ethan apparently also played Dungeons and Dragons. This being the mid-'80s, it always tends to bring up this idea of, satanic worship. Dungeons and Dragons was, for some reason, if you played it at that time, you were like, well, you might be a killer. And so they tried to find some connection to his playing that game to this, but there was no connection. And then another suspect is really just a random person. This may have just been a random killing. A random person walks up to a random car and just randomly kills. It is completely possible. It has happened time and time again. Because, like I said, police could not find any reason for these two specifically to have been murdered this way. They could not find anyone in either of their lives, at school, at home, that would indicate a motive. And so the random killing seems like it's the best option. Because this was in 1985, crime scenes weren't investigated the same way they are now. So they did not collect things with the intent of getting DNA from them. Now, the murder weapon wasn't found. However, they did find a gun holster in the car. There were rumors that Ethan had purchased a gun prior to this, but those could not be corroborated. And apparently that gun holster has since been lost. But DNA technology was really not a thing in investigators' minds in 1985. And unfortunately, that means that evidence is kind of non-existent. Doesn't mean they don't have evidence that they can retest. I know they have retested evidence that they had, but it hasn't come to any, solution or conclusion. And this is in 1985, before teenagers had email and, text messaging, Snapchat, Instagram, all that kind of stuff, the way they communicate now. So they couldn't establish any kind of, trail that way. Couldn't use any kind of GPS or cell phone towers. Usually, because I was reading an article that if this exact case happened, but like now, they would be able to find out everything they were doing minute by minute. It would pull up cell phone data, Snapchat data, extra, data. But you couldn't do that back then. They didn't have any of that. And so that's why this has probably still remained a mystery. There was a book written about this murder called The West Side Park Murders. And I think the hope there was to maybe help shed light on this case. But even now today, it still remains unsolved. Somebody somewhere out there has got to know the truth about what happened to these two teenagers. Perhaps that someone is you. You can report your information anonymously if you know something, say something. If you have any information on the murders of Ethan Dixon and Kimberly Dowell, please call 765-747-4890. Hello, true crimerers. I do have a very unfortunate update with regards to a case I covered about a month or so ago. It was the disappearance of Eugenia Cooley, who had disappeared in December of 2024. Sadly, 2 days ago, the body of Eugenia Cooley was discovered. The 47-year-old woman was last seen alive on December 21st, 2024, walking away on CCTV camera, walking away from the place where she lived. And this was in Maysville, Kentucky. Her remains were found near Walled Park in Mason County, but they have not released the cause of death or how she died, the circumstances in which her body was found. All of that has not been released at this point. I probably won't make any update videos on this unless they come out with information suggesting that she was a victim of homicide. Because at that point, you got to still try to find to get her justice. But at this point, I just wanted to let you guys know, in case you found this video from where the comment comes from, that she has been found. My condolences to her family, her daughters, and I hope they get answers as to what happened. Gene Hackman and his wife and dog are found dead in their home under suspicious circumstances. 2 other dogs found alive. The couple was found during a welfare check after their neighbor called in. I had just mentioned him in a video on my other page, a couple days ago, wondering where on earth he had been for a while. That's crazy. An investigation is underway after actor Gene Hackman, 95, and his wife Betsy, 64, were mysteriously found dead alongside a dog in their Santa Fe, New Mexico home. There were no obvious signs of death. Their deaths were suspicious enough in nature to require a thorough search and investigation due to all of the circumstances surrounding the scene, according to the search warrant. The Academy Award-winning actor was found on the floor in the mudroom. According to the search warrant, it appeared he fell suddenly, and he and his wife showed obvious signs of death. His wife was found lying on her side on the floor in the bathroom with a space heater near her body, according to the search warrant. Her body showed signs of decomposition. The document said there was mummification to her hands and feet, so they were likely dead for several days at least, maybe longer. On the counter near his wife was an opened prescription bottle with pills scattered. A German Shepherd was found deceased about 10 to 15 feet away from his wife. 2 of the dogs were found alive. 1 healthy dog was near his wife, and the other was located outside. Santa Fe City Fire Department found no signs of possible carbon monoxide leak or poisoning, the document said. If there was carbon monoxide at the scene, it could have vented out of the home through the open front door before responders arrived. New Mexico Gas Company also responded, and as of now, there are no signs or evidence indicating there were any problems associated to the pipes in and around the residence. Oh, maintenance workers hadn't seen them in 2 weeks. Wow, okay, so they might have been dead for 2 weeks. And they found the door was opened before the bodies were found, and no signs of forced entry, no items were taken or rummaged through. If the door was opened, then the cause couldn't have been poisoning, a gas leak or anything. I don't know. I'm sure more information will come out soon, but rest in peace, Gene Hackman and his wife. 7 people are left dead in an unimaginable nightmare. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of the Buckner family massacre. Viewer discretion is advised. Before I get started, please make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel, link in the link tree in my bio for more true crime stories. This case occurred on a farm property in an area known as the Heartland, just outside of Elkland, Missouri. It was September 25th, 1987. A 911 operator receives a very panicked call from a man named Jim Schnick. Jim says that he has been shot in his leg and that his nephew, his 14-year-old nephew, is dead. He says he killed his nephew in self-defense. When police arrive, they find Jim Schnick had been shot in his leg and his abdomen, but he was still alive, and he was rushed to the hospital. And they also find 14-year-old Kirk Buckner had been killed. He had been stabbed. In another room on the property, another body is found. 30-year-old Julie Schnick, also shot to death. She had been shot in her bed, and it's believed that she was asleep when the gun went off. Jim and Julie's 2 children were both alive and unharmed in another bedroom. 2 bodies and another severely injured person. But that wasn't the end. Approximately 7 miles down the road lived the Buckner family. This is the Buckner family here. Julie Schnick, the murder victim from the other property, was the sister of 35-year-old Steve Buckner. The police had gone down to their property to notify them of the murders, and what they find there, an absolute nightmare. There are 5 more bodies. The entire Buckner family had been found murdered. 35-year-old Steve, 36-year-old Jeanette, 8-year-old Dennis, 7-year-old Timmy, 2-year-old Michael, all shot to death. The 2-year-old was found in his playpen, and 14-year-old Kirk Buckner was dead at the other property. What on earth happened? James Schnick says that he heard the sound of a gunshot on his property. When he enters his home, it's pitch dark, and he claims he was attacked by an attacker just from the shadows. And he says he had a knife in his hand, and so he stabs the attacker, which he then would find out was his 14-year-old nephew, Kirk Buckner. Kirk's body was found with the gun still in his hand, his right hand. And so they pinned all of this on the 14-year-old boy. He had killed his family over on the Buckner farm. He then entered the home of his aunt and uncle, where he killed his aunt and then attempted to kill his uncle. James Schnick had no problems laying the blame completely on Kirk. Kirk's dead, he can't defend himself. So all they have now is James's word. Here's a couple big issues. Kirk, who allegedly killed his entire family, had no qualms with killing his kid siblings. He had access to the Schnick home, and it's more than obvious that based on his claim that Kirk was in the house, he killed his aunt. Why did he leave the 2 kids unharmed? It just didn't make sense. The other thing that didn't make sense is that the police would find out that Kirk was left-handed, yet the gun was found gripped in his right hand. The gun was also missing, I guess it's firing pin, which didn't make sense because you wouldn't be able to fire that particular gun without the firing pin in it. Now, it's not to say that a person who's left-handed couldn't have used their right hand to fire a gun. Sure, it's possible. But instinctively, when you're doing things, you're going to use the hand you use, your dominant hand. The other thing is that the father, Steve Buckner, was found outside of the property, and it was more than evidence that he had been shot execution style in the back of his head twice. And his body, it was more than obvious that his body had been dragged a pretty decent distance. Steve Buckner was like 6 foot tall, over 6 foot tall, and he was like 250 pounds. Kirk Buckner was a small kid, maybe 125 pounds. How on earth would he have dragged that heavy of a person? And also, what was his motive? He was a good kid. He always helped on the farm. He wanted to help. He did good in school. He had no enemies. He wasn't showing any signs of depression, anger. It didn't make sense. And so all of that evidence with like the gun being in the incorrect hand, the fact that Steve Buckner could not have possibly been moved by Kirk, the lack of a motive, the fact that James Schnick's 2 children were left unharmed while the other kids were also brutally murdered. So who killed all 7 of these people if it wasn't Kirk? Well, there was only one adult living survivor. Maybe they should look into him. And they found out that James Schnick had been having an affair with a woman named Nancy Bruner. Well, they found out from Nancy that Nancy had actually ended up telling Julie Schnick about the affair. It had been going on for quite some time. When Julie found out, she told her brother, Steve. Her brother Steve was very, very pissed off. James Schnick then gets into his car to drive down to the Buckner farm to talk to Steve, who is now pissed. An argument between Steve and James ensues. Apparently, Steve has a gun in his hand. They struggle with the gun, and the gun goes off and shoots Steve Buckner and kills him. It's not possible. Steve Buckner had been shot execution style in the back of his head twice. In a struggle for a gun, that's not really likely. 14-year-old Kirk had heard a commotion, and so he runs out and sees what happened. He then runs for his life, where his uncle shoots him in his back. James Schnick then notices that Jeanette was on the property. Now she's a witness, so he had to shoot and kill her as well. She was shot outside of the house. He then enters the house, and for whatever reason, shoots and kills the 3 children, including a 2-year-old who could not identify him, who couldn't tell anything about what happened, just shot and killed him. He then notices Kirk is still alive, so he picks up his body, gets an idea, goes back to his home, where he then stages the scene to look like Kirk attacked him in his home, places him on the ground and fires 2 more shots into Kirk just to kill him, then plants the gun in his hand, in the wrong hand, and takes out the firing pin for some reason. He then shoots and kills his wife. I guess just because at that point everyone else is dead, she'll be able to say, oh, it's probably him. And that is why the 2 children in his house were left unharmed, because they were his kids. They were very, very young. They weren't old enough to know, what would have happened, or to ID someone. That's why the other kids were killed, because, well, they weren't his. And then he had the nerve to blame his 14-year-old nephew for doing all of this. But thankfully, he was figured out very quickly. He was arrested and charged with all 7 murders. He would end up essentially confessing, saying, I blacked out, I can't remember everything, I was out of my mind, I'm insane. But that at least cleared Kirk Buckner from having any involvement in this. So his name was no longer tarnished because of this piece of shit. I guess he was only convicted of 3 murders. I'm not entirely sure why not all of them, but he was sentenced to death. But then the Supreme Court in Missouri overturned his death sentence and actually the convictions altogether, where he then ends up pleading guilty to those 3 murders, and he is handed down 3 life sentences without parole. He would later go on to do an interview on the show. I think this was the Deadliest Decade, the 1980s, I believe, which, by the way, is a really good show. They also have a 1990s version. But yeah, this is him during an interview for it, still in prison. The piece of shit, scum of the earth human being, if you can call him that, died in prison very recently. And hopefully, hell is hot. Bitch, what? The true identity of Jack the Ripper is finally exposed after 130 years. God, Jesus, this guy? Ugh. That's just Willem Dafoe. Case solved. Descendants of victims of Jack the Ripper are demanding a fresh inquest into the historic murders of their... Okay, but nobody alive today ever met the victims, family or otherwise. The 3 times great-granddaughter of one of the Ripper's victims has issued an emotional plea for the UK coroner to formally unmask the murderer, who has been identified through DNA as a man named Aaron Kosminski. I believe his name has popped up in stories of Jack the Ripper. That name is definitely very familiar. Oh. Yeah. Yeah, I see it. Let's see. He was a Polish barber who immigrated to East London in the early 1880s. He's believed to have lived near the Whitechapel locations where the Ripper's victims were killed. 1891, Kosminski threatened his sister with a knife, and who hasn't, and was institutionalized at the Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum. He died at the age of 53 in 1919 in another psychiatric hospital, and it's thought he suffered from schizophrenia. Okay... 17 years ago, a bloody scarf thought to have been worn by Catherine, one of the victims, when she died, was purchased by historical crime enthusiast Russell Edwards. He hoped it would finally uncover the Ripper's true identity. He found genetic scientists willing to examine the tattered silk scarf and analyze it under laboratory conditions. It was eventually confirmed that the shawl still contained traces of DNA from Jack the Ripper and Catherine. After 130 years, they didn't have fucking evidence bags back then. They just threw it into on a shelf. People coughed and sneezed and fucking all pooped near it. I think at one point all the evidence was stored at Jim's house, next to where his fucking dog and cat slept. Really? It was in this good-looking condition? Really? I mean, I guess it's possible, I suppose. There's no fucking way. There was DNA found on that matched the victim and this unknown suspect, Jack the Ripper. Really? Okay. With the help of a genealogist, Russell found a relative of Kosminski who was willing to offer up her own DNA for comparison. When that came back with a positive match, Russell was convinced he'd solved the case. Not just a match, 100% DNA match with suspects. How? How could it possibly be a 100% DNA match? The suspect is fucking dead for over 100 years. And his great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter. You can't 100% match DNA. You can't do that. You need the actual suspect's DNA to say 100%, right? Has Forensic Files taught me nothing? I don't believe it. I'm not buying it. What are we going to do? Arrest a ghost? arrest a corpse? We're gonna dig him up from underneath the Jesus, God, what if he actually looked like that, though? That'd be fucking horrifying. Does he have legs? Is he floating? I don't even know. I'm not buying it. I think this is a scam. Yeah, what do you guys think? A young father was seen near this boat ramp, but has never been seen since. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Jacob Briggs. Viewer discretion is advised. At the time of this case, Jacob Briggs was 28 years old. He was the father to 2 young children. So he was originally from Oregon, but then he had moved to Florida at one point where he met a girlfriend who he was still seeing at the time of this case. She was not the mother of his 2 kids, but the mother of his 2 kids, the 2 of them were in a very amicable relationship still. Jacob in his past had some mental health issues, and there was a point where he got into drugs, but when this case occurred, he had been sober for quite some time. He was a good guy, super friendly, and he was an awesome dad. He loved his kids dearly. So when this case occurred, he is now living back home in Sweet Home, Oregon. The last time his friends would see him was on the night of March 22nd, 2021. But by March 23rd, 2021, he was gone. According to Jacob's best friend, he had sent a text at some point where Jacob said, quote, "My dad is going to kill me. I really messed up. Please help." And he had attempted to call this best friend, but the best friend was not available to answer the phone. And so when his friend finally had time to call back, Jacob never picked it up. So this is Foster Lake. And this is the Gedney Creek boat ramp that goes into Foster Lake. Witnesses would state that they saw Jacob Briggs here near this boat ramp, which I think was on March 23rd. Later on the day of March 23rd, they found belongings next to this boat ramp, later to be determined to be Jacob Briggs' clothing, his work vest, his wallet, and his cell phone. And they were all in a nice little pile right on the boat ramp. But Jacob was nowhere to be found. The police, once they were notified that he was missing, they didn't take any photos or of anything. What it sounds like people have said is that Jacob just walked into the lake and drowned himself. Jacob had not been suicidal at all. But there's also one big glaring issue with this whole drowning himself thing. This is not what the lake looked like when he vanished. The lake had essentially been drained at that point. There was maybe 5-ish feet of water. These are some images of what the lake actually looked like around that time. Pretty hard to drown yourself in a lake that doesn't have that much water. But I know they also drained it further to see if they could find maybe Jacob's remains. They weren't in it. They were not in the lake. And if he was in there and he drowned, they would have found him in that lake. But they didn't. Witnesses would also come forward to state that Jacob had gotten into a pretty serious argument with his dad the night prior to his disappearance. His dad was very intoxicated and he was pissed off, and it was due to some sort of like family related issues, which coincides when he texted his friend, "My dad is going to kill me, please help." On the late night of March 22nd, 2021, Jacob's dad was seen with a shovel. They stated they saw him covered in dirt, and they also watched him walk into the woods. The dad. His mom was actually out of town when this occurred. When they reported him missing and she found out, she didn't care. She stayed out of town. She was just visiting family in California, but apparently her son being missing wasn't worth her time. She didn't come home for like a week after all of this. His mom and dad both refused to assist with looking for him. Both of his parents have come out and said, yeah, he's just dead. They didn't put up missing persons posters. Other witnesses will come forward to state that there were a number of occasions where when his dad got mad at Jacob, he would threaten Jacob and say, "I can make you disappear." His parents deleted his social media accounts. They actually asked people, stop posting pictures of Jacob online. 2 months after he went missing, his parents decided to hold a funeral. They did not invite his 2 children. And they had this like funeral service like in a different lake in Oregon. Not even the one he was last seen in or near. They seemed pretty confident he was dead. They don't have a body. They haven't found him. But 2 months later, they say, I'll just have a funeral for him. They posted pictures, I guess, from this funeral. They were all smiling and happy. Jacob's parents were also in the middle of building a new house on a property that was off of Foster Lake. But the property, I guess, was on the opposite side from where Jacob was last seen. One of the final cell phone pings was pinged at the property where they were building that new home. I know that at some point really recently, a nonprofit organization has been involved with this, and they have been out there conducting searches. It doesn't sound like the police really got all that involved. There's really very, very little coverage of this story. Jacob Briggs was a very loving and caring and doting father to 2 young girls. He would do anything for them, and he certainly would never just leave them. Everything about this screams foul play. But without a body, I know it becomes a little more difficult, especially for police to investigate cases like this. You know, they need a crime scene, they need someone, something. But his parents seem to be going out of their way to stop people from talking about this. Oops. Someone somewhere out there has got to know the truth about what occurred, about what happened to Jacob Briggs. His friends that care about him, his 2 daughters that love him, they deserve to know. The people in his life who actually care about him deserve to lay him to rest if that's the case. I understand it could be kind of terrifying coming forward given the situation, so just know you can always report information anonymously. You do not have to say who you are. Just say what you know. If you have any information on what happened to Jacob Briggs in 2021, please call 541-967-3950. A 4-year-old child was stolen from this yard, and it would take months to find her. Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of Jessica Phelps. Viewer discretion is advised. At the time of this case, Jessica Phelps was just 4 years old. And she lived here in this house in Flint, Michigan with her mom and her younger brother. This photo here of the young, smiling, happy little girl who was enjoying a summer gathering with her friends and family. This is the last photo ever taken of the 4-year-old girl. It was the afternoon of July 1st, 1997. Jessica, her mom, and her little brother had just gotten home that afternoon from going to McDonald's. Jessica's mom would go into the house and take a shower, and Jessica would go out to the front yard to play. A very common thing that, she would do. When her mom was finished with her shower, she looked through the house and couldn't find Jessica. She went to the front yard, couldn't find her. She went to neighbors' houses and called neighbors, "Hey, have you seen Jessica?" No one has. A parent's worst nightmare just became reality. Jessica was missing. The neighborhood immediately joined together to look for the little girl, but they could not find her, and she was reported missing to the police. Hundreds of volunteer searchers, including police, would search for the little girl all over Flint. They looked in all the bodies of water. They looked in all the, wooded areas. They couldn't find her. There were no witnesses who saw whatever may have happened to her. If Jessica was abducted from the front yard of her home, nobody saw it, nobody heard it. No one heard any screams or cars peeling away. And after weeks and months, people started to go back to their daily lives while Jessica was still out there somewhere. And then 9 months later, on April 2nd, 1998, a discovery was made. Jessica has been found. The skeletal remains of a small person was found in a clearing. This was about 15 miles away from Jessica's home. It took them 2 days, and they had to get dental records, but the remains would be identified as 4-year-old Jessica Phelps. Unfortunately, because of the condition of her body, and given that she was out there for 9 months exposed to the elements, there really was no evidence. The clothing she was last seen wearing was found near her body. I don't know if that means that the killer had placed her there nude and just dumped her clothes next to her, or if just over the course of 9 months, her clothing got separated by wildlife, wind, whatever. And it doesn't sound like they really truly know exactly how she died. They just know it's a homicide. They believe she was killed the day she was taken, or possibly within a day or two. The clothing to this day has not yielded any evidence. Again, it was out there for 9 months exposed to rain, wildlife, etc. It doesn't mean they can't get evidence from it, they just haven't been able to at this point. Now, allegedly they had a suspect, but apparently that suspect ended their own life back in 2007. I do not know their name, nor should I say the name just because they've never been a confirmed suspect. The home in which Jessica was stolen in front of has since become abandoned, and it is now set for demolition. It doesn't sound like they've actually demolished the home yet. It is scheduled sometime before March of 2025. It is a haunting reminder of what happened on that peaceful summer day. A little girl who was just innocently playing on the front yard was stolen by a monster. And her final moments for her had to be absolutely horrifying. But her family and her friends will always remember her for who she was. Just a bright, happy ray of sunshine. And hopefully one day her monster can be captured. Somebody somewhere out there has got to know the truth, and perhaps that someone is you. If you have any information on the murder of Jessica Phelps, please contact the Flint Police Department at 810-237-6800. You can report your information anonymously. Help Jessica and her family get the justice she rightfully deserves. It's been 41 years and they still have made no arrests. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Kelley Disney. Viewer discretion is advised. Before we get started into the case, please make sure you are subscribed to my YouTube channel where I tell even more true crime stories. Link in the link tree in my bio. Kelley was born on January 16th, 1967, and at the time of this case, she's living in Lincoln County in Oregon. I know she had at least one sister, a younger sister, and when this case occurred, Kelley herself was 17 years old. Kelley was also in a relationship with a 20-year-old man. His name was Robert Ellis. Her parents knew about this, and they agreed to let her continue dating him as long as she would stay in high school and finish school, which she agreed to do. On March 8th, 1984, Kelley was, I guess, at a party or some sort of get-together at her boyfriend's apartment in Newport, Oregon. At one point, her boyfriend leaves the apartment, and Kelley stays behind. Then, according to other partygoers, Kelley then leaves the apartment herself, and she was seen leaving at approximately 12:30 in the morning, now officially on March 9th, 1984. Her boyfriend then comes back, finds out she's gone, and so he goes out looking for her. He finds Kelley standing along Highway 20, just outside of Newport, and he pulled up next to her and said, "Hey, please get in the car, I'll take you home," but she said no, she refused. They had gotten into some kind of argument, and so he basically ends up taking off. Later, other witnesses would come forward to state that they also saw Kelley on the side of the road. They pulled up next to her and offered her a ride, but she refused to get a ride from them, which checks out because according to Kelley's family, Kelley would never in a million years get into a vehicle of a person she didn't know. But these two individuals who saw her called police or went to the police and said, "Hey, there's a young girl, side of the highway. It's, really early and it's 1 o'clock in the morning. You might want to go check on her." So then a Lincoln County deputy from the sheriff's office went out to that area and found Kelley Disney on the side of the road. Again, she was alive and well. Everything was normal, except it's 1 o'clock in the morning and you have this young girl on the side of the road. Well, he offers to give her a ride. She refuses that as well. She told him, "I'm on my way to a friend's apartment. I'll be there soon." And from that point on, nobody would ever see Kelley Disney alive ever again. She would eventually be reported missing. And it sounds like they believe that there is a 15 to 20 minute window of time after that sheriff's deputy saw her, that in that window of time, somebody took her. Either she willingly got into the car of someone, or someone forcibly abducted her off the road. Now again, she would not get into the car of someone she didn't know. So there is a working theory that someone pulled up next to her that she was friends with or knew and trusted enough to get in their car. But they just don't know. The police were really looking at this as a runaway. She's this 17-year-old kid. Kids do this, they run away. So they weren't necessarily taking this as seriously as they probably could have at the time. They had a very kind of stop and go style of investigating cases like this, which would end up hindering it. 10 years later, a human skull is found. And using dental records, they're able to confirm that the skull belonged to 17-year-old Kelley Disney. Her skull was the only thing that was ever found. So they don't know how she died, but they have labeled this a homicide. And ever since then, the family has put up signs along Highway 20 to say, "Hey, if anyone saw anything or knows anything, please come forward." Somebody knows something, someone has to. Someone did it to her. And I've been reading, it sounds like that there are 4 people in mind. They know the names of 4 people they think did this to her. Those names, though, I'm not sure. I don't see them released publicly. The police's theory is that she was, in fact, picked up by someone she knew enough and trusted enough to get into the car. That they have, I guess, reason to believe, or through witness statements and evidence, that she was near 4 people in that car. But the problem is that they don't have physical evidence to actually connect one or all of them to this murder. And her family still continues to pursue justice for Kelley. You know, if you think about it, it's about 40 years ago this happened. If her killer was a fellow teenager, they're in their mid to late 50s, maybe early 60s, depending on how old they were at the time. So obviously they could very much still be alive. And somebody somewhere out there has got to know the truth. If 4 people were involved with this, or at least 4 people knew what happened, one of them at least has to have said something to someone. And maybe you're no longer associated or connected to that person, and you are the someone who that information was given to. You can report information anonymously. You do not have to say who you are. Just got to say what you know. If you have any information on the murder of Kelley Disney, please call 541-265-0284. A task force in Canada has investigated the cases of at least 18 missing or murdered primarily Indigenous women. This is one of those stories. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Lana Derrick. Viewer discretion is advised. At the time of this case, Lana Derrick was 19 years old, and she was a member of the Gatineau band. Lana was known by friends and family as a prankster. She loved being outdoors. She was just a really fun person to be around. And her plan was right after high school, she's going to enroll in college, which Lana would enroll in the forestry program at Northwest Community College, which is in British Columbia. She was raised in Terrace, British Columbia. The Friday before Thanksgiving in 1995, Lana would take the 3-hour drive down back to Terrace to be with her family. That particular weekend, she knew her parents were going to be out of town, so when she arrived at her home, she just dropped off her belongings and left the house and went into town. At some point that afternoon, she runs into her stepsister, Clarice. Clarice tells her that her parents had left some money for Lana. Lana says, can you just pick up that money and bring it back to your apartment, Clarice's apartment, and that Lana would be by later to pick it up. Lana arrives at Clarice's apartment at 3 o'clock in the morning. And by the way, so that there is no confusion, Thanksgiving in Canada, or Canadian Thanksgiving, is actually in October. And so at that 3 o'clock in the morning on October 7th, 1995, Lana goes to her stepsister's apartment and picks up the money. She asks Clarice, I'm going to a party. Did you want to come with me? Clarice says, no, it's way too late. Lana leaves, and that's it. Clarice herself did not notice that there were any vehicles maybe in the street that were waiting for Lana. She didn't see anyone with her, and she didn't really think anything of it. Later that weekend, her parents come back home and they notice that Lana's stuff is still at the house, but Lana is not there. It was normal for her to be gone, for the weekend, but by Monday, when she still wasn't home, they felt something was wrong. So they reached out to Lana's friends and other family members, and nobody has seen her or heard from her. The last time anyone can recall actually seeing her was by Clarice on that October 7th morning. When they reported Lana officially missing to police, the family believed that the RCMP was sort of just brushing this off, that they weren't taking it seriously, which is, unfortunately the case when it comes to Indigenous women. It would be about a week later or so when police finally kind of got involved in the search for Lana, but eventually they couldn't find her and they kind of just sort of disbanded. The police may have been done, but the family and friends were not. About a month after she is reported missing, someone comes forward, a witness, to state that they saw Lana that morning, the morning she would have disappeared, at a Petro-Canada gas station in Thornhill, which I guess is the Copperside location. There were witnesses from the gas station who would then later tell people that they saw Lana getting into some kind of blue car, and she got in and out of the back seat of that car, and there were 2 individuals in the car, and so they came up with these composite drawings of those individuals. They do not know if they are responsible for whatever happened to Lana. They might just be witnesses, but nobody has come forward to identify them, which does raise a lot of red flags and makes it very suspicious. Unfortunately, because so much time had passed before the witness came forward, the gas station had already recorded over the footage from the morning in question. So there was no footage of Lana at the gas station. I'm reading in one report that apparently Lana had a boyfriend at the time and that he may have been a suspect in whatever may have happened to her. And apparently that boyfriend ended up taking his own life within a couple of days of Lana's disappearance. However, the RCMP has never found any connection between him and whatever may have happened to Lana. The RCMP at some point created a task force called the EPANA, which was put in place to investigate the missing person cases or murders of at least 18 women who went missing along Highway 16. This very, very long stretch of highway that I have talked about numerous times in other cases, but it's been nicknamed the Highway of Tears. And it's primarily Indigenous women who go missing or are found murdered along this highway. Lana is just another one of those women. The task force, I believe, was put in place to see if there was like a serial killer doing all of these, or if any of them were actually connected to one another at all. But in the end, the disappearance of Lana Derrick still remains a mystery. She has never been found. No trace of her has ever been found. This was in the mid-90s. She didn't have a cell phone. You couldn't ping it. None of her information has ever been used or touched ever since. And these two men right here just might be the key to finding out what happened to Lana. Surely somebody somewhere out there has got to recognize these two men. Perhaps that someone is you. If you have any information on the whereabouts of Lana Derrick or what may have happened to her back in 1995, and or if you recognize these two individuals, please call 1-866-962-5585. Help bring Lana home. A husband was expecting his wife at an airport, but the reality is that he would never see her again. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Leesa Jo Shaner. Viewer discretion is advised. 22-year-old Leesa Jo Shaner was married to Gary Shaner, and they were very, very happily married. They had 2 children together, Krista and Brady. Leesa was an amazing mom, and she loved her kids, and she loved her husband. She was also the daughter of an FBI agent, a man named James Miller. But on one tragic day in 1973, her family and loved ones would never see her again. It was May 29th, 1973. Leesa had left her home around 9:25 p.m. and she was going to be heading to the Tucson International Airport to pick up her husband Gary. He had been out of town. But when Gary arrived at the airport, Leesa wasn't there. That was really unusual because she was very punctual, and he knows that she left the house. He walks around looking for her but cannot find her. But then eventually he finds her car in the parking lot. The driver's side window was rolled halfway down, as if she had been in the middle of talking to someone. Her purse was in the back seat. Nothing stolen from it. So she was reported missing and a search would begin. And with her dad being in the FBI, they had a lot of resources. They didn't have any solid evidence with the car. But in May of 1973, near Fort Huachuca, Arizona, the remains of a young woman were found. They were buried in a shallow grave. And a coroner would take them, they would do dental records, and confirmed that they were the remains of Leesa Jo Shaner. Her cause of death, they were not able to determine what it was, but they were confident. They knew for a fact that this was a homicide. You don't bury yourself in a shallow grave. At one point, this man here, Gregory Barker, was considered a suspect because he actually worked near Fort Huachuca, Arizona, at the time that Leesa was killed. He had actually murdered this woman here, Hilda Roche. I believe I covered her case before. But they never found any evidence that linked him to her murder. And eventually he was just ruled out. And then Leesa's case goes cold. It goes cold for decades. It wouldn't be until August of 2009 when they finally found her killer. William Lloyd Zamastil. So there was DNA found near the crime scene where Leesa was discovered. Obviously back in 1973, they didn't have the DNA technology that they have, nowadays. But in 2009, they were able to build up a profile for the DNA they found. And eventually it linked them to this man here because he was already in prison. He had committed at least 2 other murders prior and was serving a life sentence. And so his DNA at one point was put into the database. And that's how they were able to finally link his DNA to the DNA found with Leesa's remains. In 2011, he would go on trial and he was found guilty of the murder of Leesa Jo Shaner. He was given an additional life sentence without parole. He wasn't someone that came up in the original investigation. This was seemingly random. They didn't know each other. The murders that William committed, that he was in prison for before they found out he killed Leesa, they occurred after he killed Leesa. They occurred sometime between 1978 and 1979. Meaning if they had somehow been able to catch him after her murder, a few more people would be alive still. And that's why it's so vital now that we have the technology we do. They did not have this ability back in 1973, so it's not anyone's fault. But when things like this happen now, let cases like this be a great example that DNA technology truly is the saving grace of forensics, of forensic science. And because of it, Leesa Jo Shaner was finally able to get the justice she very rightfully deserved. I just want to thank you all so much for watching. Please make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel where I tell more true crime stories in long form. The link to my YouTube channel is linked in the link tree in my bio. This is the image of a woman who abducted a child from a hospital. Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of Marlene Santana. Viewer discretion is advised. On October 18th, 1985, Francesca Santana, pictured here, would enter a Brooklyn hospital to give birth to her baby. She delivered a very healthy baby named Marlene. 3 days later, on October 21st, 1985, Francesca was set to leave the hospital with Marlene. But before that, she would look at her baby from, that little window where you can see all the babies in. And when she did that, Francesca was met by another woman she did not recognize. The woman claimed she was there to look at a friend's baby, but then she pointed out Marlene and told Francesca, "Is that your daughter? She's lovely." She said Marlene was the most quiet and the most beautiful girl there. Francesca, thinking nothing of it, said, "Well, thank you very much." At 9 p.m., Francesca was finally released from the hospital with baby Marlene. This was around 9 p.m., and her two sister-in-laws were there to help bring the baby home. All of a sudden, they were confronted by this woman here, the same woman who was talking to Francesca about her baby. At first, when she approached the women with the baby, everything seemed normal, like, "Oh, hello." But then this woman took out a gun and pointed it at Marlene's head and told Francesca, "Keep walking." And so she abducted Francesca, Marlene, and the two sister-in-laws. She forced them at gunpoint to walk approximately 6 blocks. When they finally got to a deserted junkyard, this woman would tell Francesca, "Give me your baby now, or I will kill you and I will kill her." Francesca, fearing for everyone's lives, complied. This individual took the baby and got into a car that was being driven by someone else, described as a white 1976 Chevy Malibu, and they took off with Marlene. Baby Marlene has never been seen since. Francesca and her sister-in-laws obviously report this to the hospital staff and police. It sounds like there were enough witnesses to corroborate that this story actually occurred. I don't know all the details though, like if hospital staff saw this or I'm not really sure, because it doesn't sound like anyone intervened to stop this from occurring. So I don't know if the abductor was just really good at hiding the gun to make it look like, this group of women was just walking with each other normally. But the story was believed. And police would eventually come to the conclusion that the woman who abducted Marlene, in all likelihood, this was a woman who probably very recently lost her own child. Whether it be through maybe a miscarriage or some other tragedy that occurred, or maybe she couldn't give birth and she was upset that she couldn't have children. These are all just kind of theories about what would have been a motive for her to have taken Marlene. They put this composite drawing up on the news, but nobody came forward to say that they recognized her. Approximately 2 years later, they would come up with this composite sketch of what Marlene may look like as a 2-year-old child. And then the following year, they came up with another composite drawing of what she may look like at the age of 3. There is belief that Marlene was probably taken to be sold into child trafficking or sold to someone who was looking to adopt but couldn't go through the right channels. But to this day, baby Marlene has never been located. A day before baby Marlene's abduction, another baby was kidnapped from another hospital in Brooklyn, a young boy named Christopher Morgan. He was found, I think, a couple of months later, alive, and it was a woman who abducted him. However, they were able to determine that this was not the same woman that abducted Marlene. Marlene's father, Thomas, was actually in the Dominican Republic at the time the birth happened. He was nowhere near where all of this took place. He was ruled out as a suspect. And again, the story that Francesca and the two sister-in-laws gave, it sounds like it was confirmed. And so I don't think Francesca has fallen under any suspicion. If alive today, Marlene may look something similar to this. It is very possible she was sold to someone as, an adoption type thing. And whoever may have purchased her, which is insane to say, they would have to have laid low. They may not have, brought this child out for the public to see. Somebody out there knows something. Someone kidnapped this little girl right from her mother's arm. And it's time now. I mean, it's 40 years later. It's time to come forward. If you know something, you have got to say something. If you recognize her, if you are her, please come forward. Marlene would be about 39, 40 years old. Her abductor, believed to be in her mid-20s around the time of the abduction, would be somewhere around her early to mid-60s. She was 5'2", approximately 130 pounds. She was described as Caucasian with Hispanic features, but had no accent. She had dyed reddish blonde hair, and there is a possibility police believe that she was mentally unstable, mentally unwell. And again, the getaway vehicle was a white 1976 Chevy Malibu. I know it's been 40 years and these things are going to be hard to remember, but if you were a part of this or knew something about this, you're always going to remember. I just realized I forgot to mention this. Marlene had a birth defect with her feet. It was something called metatarsus adductus. Her feet are going to appear C-shaped if viewed from the bottom. So this will be a normal foot. This would be the condition she had and would still have today. If you have any information on what happened to Marlene that day or where she might be today, please call 646-610-6914. Sometimes working in a convenience store can be a very deadly job. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Martin Hernandez. Viewer discretion is advised. I have very little information on Martin's story. I do know that on October 10th, 1992, Martin married the love of his life, Ida Mesa, and they were living in the Los Angeles, California area. Martin was working at a convenience store there in Los Angeles. I am not 100% sure which one. But on the early morning hours of July 25th, 1993, Martin Hernandez was doing his job there, and he was alone. At some point, a customer walks in and finds a nightmare. 26-year-old store clerk Martin Hernandez was dead. He had been shot to death, and the store was also robbed. There was surveillance video cameras in the store. Unfortunately, they were really, really bad quality. It got to a point where they had to bring in this firm, I guess, Cognitech, to see if they could basically enhance the images, because it was divided into like 4 little quadrants. There was 4 cameras, but they all showed on one screen. So each little segment was very tiny and very grainy. You couldn't necessarily zoom in on one of them. It appeared that the person who did this also shot at or towards some of the recording equipment. But they were able to see that there were at least 2 different people who entered the store and committed this crime. Based on eyewitness accounts in terms of people who saw someone near the store around the times the murder happened, and kind of lining that up with the video that they do have, one of the suspects looks like this. African American, 6 feet tall, anywhere between the age of 21 to 30 years old, and approximately 185, 190 pounds or so. This was just one of the assailants. There was at least one more, if not more than that. But unfortunately, they've never been captured. And Martin's wife, his family, his loved ones, his friends, they have all gone decades without answers, without knowing who did this to Martin. And that's completely unfair. I wish there was more published about this case, but there just isn't. And I've given you all the information that is readily available. Martin Hernandez deserves justice. Somebody killed him, cold blood. One of the killers may have looked something like this back in 1993. Surely somebody somewhere out there knows the truth, and perhaps that someone is you. If you have any information, please call the Los Angeles Crime Stoppers at 1-800-222-TIPS. Thank you all so much for watching. Please make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel with many more true crime stories. Link in the link tree in my bio.
All these women saying they choose the bear, but I've never seen a man drown 5 kids because he had the baby blues.
Chris Watts murdered his 2 children. Ryan Lawrence murdered his 21-month-old baby. Josh Powell murdered his 2 children by blowing up the house after he murdered his wife. allegedly. Gregory Green murdered his 2 biological children and his 2 stepchildren. Gerardo Ordaz drowned his 2-year-old daughter in a church, in the church's baptismal font. Anthony Sanders beat and bit his daughter and then smothered her against the floor until she was dead. Why? She interrupted his video game. Robert Fisher blew up his house, killing his wife and his 2 children. Matthew Coleman killed his 2 children because he said his wife passed on serpent DNA to his 2 kids. Chad Doerman, he murdered his 3 children. Timothy Jones Jr. murdered his 5 children. Simon Peter Nelson murdered his 6 kids. You want to go old-timey? John List killed his entire family, including his 3 children. William Parente killed his entire family, including his 2 children. Christian Longo killed his wife and his 3 very young children. Stephen Supple, he beat his wife and 4 adopted children to death with a baseball bat. John Sharp murdered his wife and little daughter. Shall I go on? I can go on if you like. How about men who've killed children that weren't theirs? You know, like Nicholas Cruz, who killed 17 of his fellow classmates' children. How about the Robb Elementary shooter? Killed 21 people, including 19 children. How about the Sandy Hook shooter? He killed 28 people that day, including 20 children. Again, I could continue going on for probably quite some time, but I think you've maybe gotten the point now. Maybe. His vehicle was found over an hour away from where he was last seen, but the question still remains, where is Michael? Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Michael Fazzari. Viewer discretion is advised. Before I get started, real quick, please make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel for more true crime stories. Link in the link tree in my bio. At the time of this case, Michael Fazzari was an 18-year-old kid in the Phoenix, Arizona area. He had just recently graduated from Pinnacle High School, and he was working a job at a Jack-in-the-Box. At the time this case occurred, he had a girlfriend. He was also just a really popular kid. Michael's dad would describe Michael as just one of the greatest people you'd ever meet. He was kind and considerate, he was happy-go-lucky, and he was someone, even at a young age, who would trust people and he would help people, strangers. His goal was to actually one day become a firefighter. One of the final things he ever texted his dad was, I want to become a firefighter, and was wondering if basically he could help him, talk to some and see what the process is. But unfortunately, Michael never got the opportunity. Michael was last seen on June 30th, 2019. That day, he had worked his afternoon shift at the Jack-in-the-Box. Then he went to hang out with his girlfriend. Michael was with the girlfriend until about 11 p.m. when his girlfriend's dad said, all right, you got to go because, my girl's got to get to sleep. At that same time, Michael's family, who he lived with, was actually out at a Buffalo Wild Wings, and they were out pretty late. So Michael goes home, but he is basically there by himself. And so they believe at that point he decides to then leave the house and go to his friend's place. Now, the friend lived somewhere around the 2600 block of East Beardsley Road in Phoenix, Arizona. And from what it sounds like, he did make it to the friend's house. And then at some point that night, he decides to leave. Michael is last seen leaving this area now on the morning of July 1st, 2019. He drove off in his vehicle, a Ford Explorer, and he's never been seen since. Just a couple of days later, in the Yavapai County area of Arizona, this is roughly an hour and a half or so north of where he was last seen, in a very remote location, his vehicle was found and it was abandoned. Michael didn't really go to that area very often. He actually had just recently gotten his driver's license from what it looks like, and he wasn't one to drive that far out. And so his family believes, and it sounds like police probably also believe this, that someone planted that car in that area to throw the scent off. But when Michael didn't come home literally that, same day, later that afternoon on July 1st, his family became immediately worried. This was not like him. They texted him, they called him, they were getting no response. So they reported him missing to police. And a very large search began for him. They brought in helicopters, drones, cadaver dogs, the works, and they especially focused their search around the area his car was found. But they have searched in other locations as well. They just have had no luck. It sounds like his vehicle, the way it was found as if I guess the tires had been cut or slashed, and it was in a ditch. And so it really looks like foul play was involved here. And it does sound like police believe foul play is involved. I can't see anything that mentions if they have checked his cell phone data, like where it pinged and whatnot. I have to imagine that if he had one on him, they would have done that. I just don't see any mention of it, or if that information is being kept private, or if it just yielded no results. I have to also imagine that they have thoroughly forensically examined his vehicle. I just don't see any mention of what exactly they've done and what, if anything, they got from that search. But the most important thing here is that Michael is still missing. He was 18 years old at the time of this case. He was really looking forward to a future. He wanted to be a firefighter. He did well at his job. He had a girlfriend that he loved. He had friends that he loved spending time with. No indications that he would, just pick up and leave on his own. And no one really believes that's what happened. Somewhere along the way, he met with foul play. But what exactly that foul play is unknown. I imagine they've interviewed the friends he was last seen with. I just don't know what's come from that interview process. There's not a whole lot of details, unfortunately, like specific details about this case. But somebody somewhere out there has got to know the truth about what happened to Michael Fazzari that night. Perhaps that someone is you. If you're afraid to come forward out of retaliation, maybe, you can report information anonymously. If you were one of his friends that knows something but are terrified of saying something, you've got to say something. His family doesn't have him. His family deserves the answers. His family deserves to bring him home. Imagine if it was you or someone part of your family. Again, you can report information anonymously. They never have to know who reported it. If you have any information on the whereabouts of Michael Fazzari, please call 480-948-6377. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Naomi Freeman. Viewer discretion is advised. Before I get started, please make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel for more true crime stories. Link in the link tree in my bio. This case occurred in the Phoenix, Arizona area, kind of in my neck of the woods. Specifically, it happened on West Denton Lane in the 1600 block. Sadly, I don't really have much information about Naomi. I know that she was 24 years old, but outside of that, there is almost nothing published about her, except for what happened to her on her last day alive. It was June 24th, 2004. On the 1600 block of West Denton Lane, witnesses saw a vehicle driving down the road when it stopped and the person opened a door and someone was pushed out of the truck. And that person just collapsed to the ground and then the vehicle took off. When bystanders approached the individual on the ground, they noticed a woman and she was covered in blood. She had been shot in her stomach. They called 911, and when an ambulance arrived, unfortunately, Naomi Freeman would be pronounced deceased. The vehicle in question was described as a late 1990s model short bed truck, and it had, on the license plate, it had the letters J, T, and L. Now, this information was obviously published in 2004. I mean, now it's 2025. That truck is probably long gone, and that license plate is probably long gone. But someone may just recognize the description of the vehicle from, 20 plus years ago. And I can see that the police has said they've had leads that they have, looked at, but nothing has come from them. This woman, 24-year-old woman, was just shot in the stomach and thrown out of a moving vehicle. And the question of who did it remains to this day. And why did it happen? That question also remains. I don't have anything else. There's no suspects have been named, no persons of interest. Her entire story has come down to literally a small paragraph. I wish I knew more. But somebody somewhere out there might know the truth about what happened to Naomi Freeman on that June day in 2004. Perhaps that someone is you. If you have any information on her unsolved homicide, please call 602-876-1087. Hello, true crimerers. I have a brief case update on the case I covered a couple of years ago, the case of Nick Vitechnik. This young man here from Taylorsville, Utah. If you click the comment, you can go back and watch my original video. He was brutally murdered in May of 2021 by a so-called friend of his named Rowdy Aguilar. Nick was stabbed to death and then he was dismembered by this other teenager. Rowdy, the individual who is charged with his murder, would basically at this point is claiming not guilty based on reasons of insanity. He said that he believed Nick was a non-human alien. Listen, I know there are people out there who are genuinely, insane in that definition, but a lot of times you have people who claim this type of plea because they don't want to acknowledge the guilt in themselves. They want to lessen their involvement in the actual crime, basically trying to play the victim. But that is up for a jury to ultimately decide. The update on this case is that a trial is finally set for April of 2025. Specifically April 21st to April 26th of 2025. A jury of his peers will have to determine if Rowdy was genuinely insane or if he knowingly, intentionally committed this murder. So hopefully, very, very soon, Nick will finally, and his family, will finally get the justice he rightfully deserves. Will you stop giving us O.J. Simpson shows for the love of shit? We know the story. What's next? The perspective from his toothbrush? Jesus. He's dead now. Do people think that this is the only true crime story that exists on this planet? We don't need to see it from every goddamn angle. Ugh. Anyways, thank you very much. Subscribe to my YouTube channel for more true crime stories that are not O.J. Simpson. Link in the link tree in my bio. Fuck you, OJ. A 65-year-old cold case was solved with DNA. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Patricia Kalitsky and Lloyd Bogle. Viewer discretion is advised. It was January 3rd, 1965. These three boys here were just walking along a river, the Sun River near Wadsworth Park, and this is near Great Falls, Montana. They came across this scene, a vehicle, and lying next to that vehicle was a dead body. This was later identified as the body of 18-year-old Lloyd Bogle. Or is it, I'm not sure if it's Bogle or Boggle. Lloyd's hands were bound behind his back with his own belt. All of the money he had on him, his valuables, still there in the car. The car was still on. Lloyd ultimately had been shot to death. The last time anyone saw Lloyd was actually the night prior when he was at a drive-in date with his girlfriend, Patricia. But when his car was found, it was just him. Patricia was nowhere to be found. But unfortunately, it would take about a day or so later when she was found. Her remains had just been thrown in this little ditch here. Patricia had also been shot to death. Now, the coroner at the autopsy, unfortunately, there was no evidence that they were able to use at that time to help them with identifying any suspects. They processed Lloyd's car, but there were no valuable clues or any kind of evidence in that either. I don't believe they had any fingerprints or anything. However, they did take a vaginal swab of Patricia and they kept that on a slide. And they stored that slide, thankfully, very properly. And it stayed in perfect condition for 65 years. Because for that entire time, they had exhausted every lead. They had thousands and thousands of pages of casework on this. But unfortunately, their investigation just led them nowhere. They didn't know who would want to do this to them. Obviously, the motive here was likely rape. Seeing as how nothing was stolen from them, it's believed that the two of them were at a lover's lane when they were attacked and accosted by an unknown assailant. They probably tied up Lloyd and just shot him in his head because they didn't care about him. They wanted Patricia. They then took Patricia somewhere else where they sexually assaulted her and then shot her. There were no witnesses. This happened kind of out in the middle of nowhere, really. But it was not from lack of trying. I mean, they really were trying to investigate this as best as they could. They just never got any luck. But 65 years later, they finally got somewhere. That DNA swab that they had done from Patricia's remains, they were finally able to test it. Now that technology has obviously greatly advanced. It's pretty crazy because back in 1956, DNA wasn't even remotely close to being a thing yet in terms of an investigative tool. So the fact that they swabbed that and they kept it, that's pretty incredible. They compared it to DNA from Lloyd and it was not his seminal fluid. So it means that that seminal fluid came from another male, likely their killer. Then, using the technology that was used to capture the Golden State Killer, they were able to narrow it down to a specific family and then down to a specific person from that family. It was a man named Kenneth Gourd. He had no connections to the couple. He had never met them before. He was never a suspect in this case, not even a person of interest. His name literally never came up. But at that time, they were able to confirm that he did live in Great Falls, Montana. As a matter of fact, he lived about a mile away from where Patricia lived. However, Kenneth Gord died in 2007. But he did have family. He had relatives. So the police had to go to those family members and say, listen, we have a tough question to ask you. Your dad was never considered a suspect in this case, a double homicide. We've been able to link it down to him, but we need to confirm it. And are you willing to provide your DNA samples in order for us to confirm with certainty that it was him? And they did. They allowed them to take their DNA. And they were able to confirm with certainty that the murderer of both Patricia and Lloyd was Kenneth Gord. Literally just a thrill kill for him. He wanted to sexually assault someone, and Lloyd was just there, and he was in the way. But what's most important to learn from this, justice may not be served, and that, it sucks. But something to learn from this is that, like I said, this is a 65-year-old cold case. 65 years. This was in 1956. They can solve a case with DNA from 65 years ago. That means that any case that maybe you are familiar with, maybe you have a loved one who was murdered and there's little evidence, let this case be a very prime example that just be patient and have hope, because one day they could find the tiniest evidence and get something from it and help close a case and hopefully get justice for that murdered loved one. They may not have gotten justice here, but at least their families, the remaining family, was able to finally get the answers. Oh my, nice teardrops. The good news is that he's now crying permanently in hell. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Robert Comer. Viewer discretion is advised. It was February 23rd, 1987, and this occurred near Apache Lake, which is in Arizona. Robert Comer and his girlfriend at the time were out there camping. Near their campsite was another man who was there camping named Larry Pritchard. A photo of him, unfortunately, I cannot find. Larry was a victim of wrong place, wrong time. Robert Comer and his girlfriend would say, hey, Larry, or, guy, come over here and hang out with us. They seemed friendly enough. So Larry goes over to their campsite, he eats dinner with them and has a drink. At 9 p.m. that night, Robert Comer takes out a gun and shoots Larry Pritchard right in the back of his head and then slits his throat and watches him die. For what reason? It's really not known. 2 hours later, Robert and his girlfriend pose as law enforcement officers and they go to another campsite. There was a man and a woman there, and what the couple did was they tied up the man to his truck, and that man was there with his 19-year-old girlfriend. And while her boyfriend is now tied up to their truck, Robert Comer rapes the 19-year-old girl right in front of the man. Then they kidnap the 19-year-old girl, leave the man tied to his truck, and drive away. The following morning, something happened with Robert Comer's truck, and he had to pull over and try to fix it. While he did that, the 19-year-old girl that they had kidnapped managed to escape. This poor 19-year-old girl ran barefoot as fast as she could. She ran through the rough terrain, because this is kind of in the middle of nowhere at that time, and she was out there looking for help for 23 hours. When finally someone drove past her on the road, and she managed to flag them down and ask them to help her. According to the girl, she would tell police that she was actually aided in her escape from Robert. It was Robert's own girlfriend that helped her get away from the truck. So searchers, police would go out to that area where the girl was picked up, and they did a humongous, search around that area. Eventually, using scent dogs, they were able to track Robert Comer and his girlfriend Willis, who was still with him, at a campsite, and both of them were arrested. The 19-year-old girl would later testify against Comer at his trial, gave, a very horrific account of how she was raped, and then, her kidnapping ordeal. He also had stolen Larry Pritchard's dog, a beagle, and he killed the dog right in front of the 19-year-old girl. But they were able to use that to link him to the murder of Larry Pritchard. His girlfriend, Geneva Willis, also testified against him, and she was sentenced to 8 years in prison for her role in the kidnapping. Robert Comer was sentenced to death. At first, he appealed his conviction, but it got to a point sometime around the year 2000 where he would officially withdraw any further appeals. He would say, quote, "I killed for no good reason and screwed up the lives of many innocent people. I think it's time for me to pay the price. It's just time to end it," end quote. He basically asked to die. On May 22nd, 2007, Robert Comer had a final meal consisting of fried okra, 4 buns with lots of butter and salt, and 2 slices of banana bread. His final words were simply, "Go Packers." He was executed by lethal injection. A former Playboy model is found murdered, and her case remains unsolved. Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of Star Stowe. Viewer discretion is advised. Star Stowe, who was born Ellen Louise Price, she changed her name, it was like her stage name. She was born in Little Rock, Arkansas back in 1956. She grew up and had that small town girl vibe, but she also wanted to make it big. And she certainly had the beauty for it. She actually wanted to be a musician or a dancer. This would take her to Las Vegas, Nevada, where she would perform. And there, it's when she met Kiss guitarist Gene Simmons. They met at the Hotel Sahara. They hit it off and they became a couple. They would actually remain a couple for approximately 3 years or so. And her relationship with Gene Simmons actually kind of got her introduced to people like Hugh Hefner, and she would eventually find her way into the Playboy Mansion. By age 20, she was a Playboy model. She was basically encouraged or almost told to drink and do drugs while she was around Hugh Hefner, and she fell into addiction from this. And this would eventually send her into a spiral, and she would become depressed. Her relationship with Gene Simmons would end, and it got to a point where people knew she needed to be in rehab, yet they didn't really do anything for her. She never went to rehab. By 1981, she actually finds her way back to Las Vegas, where she meets a musician in 1981, and they get married. Not this individual, this is actually Elton John. But her and her husband would end up having a child together. But eventually, that relationship would end. Star would then find her way to Florida. And when she arrived there, she found gigs like dancing. She would end up stripping. And she became a sex worker as well, just to make ends meet. And it's believed that she was trying at this point to really get her life kind of back on the upswing. She was doing everything she could to find her footing again, get away from all of that bad stuff from her past. But unfortunately, the world will never know if she would ever succeed in that. On March 16th, 1997, 40-year-old Star Stowe, she was seen out between 3 p.m. and 5 p.m. in the Coral Springs, Florida area, and she was doing sex work at that time. Later that same day, Star's body was found. She had been strangled to death just 3 days before her 41st birthday. Police believe that Star was likely dumped there around 5 p.m. that day, and that's probably around the time she was killed. Police worked this case. They put hundreds of hours of man-hours into this. But in a world of, drugs, alcohol, and sex work, a lot of people remain silent. And, a lot of people don't come forward with information they might have. It's not really known if this was related to her sex work or anything like that. Could this have just been random? It's really not known. Around this same time in the Fort Lauderdale, Florida area, a couple of other women had been murdered in similar fashion. Then it happened again and again. All of this was happening to known sex workers in the area. So police had theorized that perhaps a serial killer is going around. They just don't know if that's really the case. And was Star part of that, or was it someone else? Were there multiple killers going around? Unfortunately, to this very day, the murder of Star Stowe remains unsolved. Star was not really introduced to the world of drugs and alcohol and all that until she became a Playboy model. There is kind of that belief that, if she never had gotten involved with that, she might still be around today. But unfortunately, we'll never know. Somebody somewhere out there has got to know the truth about what happened to Star Stowe that day in 1997. Perhaps that someone is you. If you have any information, please call 954-828-5700. 2 days after a woman goes missing, the house she was living in exploded, but she has still never been found. Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of Susan Lynn Dawson. Viewer discretion is advised. Real quick before we get started, please subscribe to my YouTube channel for more true crime stories. The link is in the link tree in my bio. Susan Dawson was born on June 3rd, 1958, and she grew up in Winnipeg, which is in Manitoba in Canada. Unfortunately, there really isn't much information about Susan or her life. I do know that by 1985, she is 27 years old and she had some sort of issue happen to her house and she was basically homeless. So she would end up moving in with a friend, a man named Terry Murphy, whose photo I cannot find. And this actually brought her to Neville in Saskatchewan in Canada. There is discrepancies with regards to Susan and Terry's relationship because some of the articles state that she was his live-in housekeeper, and other places state that they were a couple. It's not 100% clear. Terry would typically have a lot of house parties at his place. Sometimes they were large parties, sometimes they were just small get-togethers. On November 12, 1985, Terry would hold another party at his home. The following day, in front of the house where this all happened, there was this blue vehicle parked out front of Terry's home, but nobody recognized the vehicle. Then, on November 14, 1985, at 11:55 a.m., police are notified that Terry's house has exploded. And this is a photo of the house after that. Inside the house, police located one body, later identified as Terry Murphy. Susan Dawson, however, was not in the house. Susan Dawson had not been seen since the night that party occurred on November 12th. Susan also had a dog there at the house, but the dog was also not found in the house anywhere. A few days later, Susan's car is found parked in front of a grocery store, and her purse was in the back seat. Nothing was stolen from it. Through their investigation, the police would uncover the fact that the blue vehicle found in front of Terry's house, the one that neighbors reported seeing, well, Terry himself rented that vehicle on November 12th. It was a 1985 Buick. Now, the rental company would help police uncover that the vehicle, since Terry had rented it, had driven approximately 185 miles, or about 300 kilometers or so. Police found a bullet hole in the trunk of the vehicle, and on the front seat there was a clip of rifle bullets. So they uncovered that Terry had recently been charged with some crimes. 15 counts of charges related to guns. He was supposed to go to court on December 3rd, 1985. He also was being charged or indicted with several wildlife-related crimes, wildlife infractions, and what he would tell friends about this is that he was livid about especially these wildlife charges. And he told his friends that he was going to rig his vehicle with dynamite and blow up the people who were responsible for, these charges and indictments. Well, then his house explodes on November 14th, with Terry's body found inside. Was he rigging said explosion to put into that Buick and something happened where it just blew up? And most importantly, where is Susan? So she was seen at that gathering at Terry's house on the night of November 12th and early into the mornings of November 13th. But nobody can recall seeing her on the 13th or the 14th. When the house exploded, that's when people realized she was missing, but no one could account for her whereabouts since the night of November 12th. And there were not a single trace of her found in that house. Her body would have been found if she was in it when it exploded. Her car was found away from the house. Was this related, her disappearance related to Terry's issues? Did he end her life somehow, some way, for whatever reason? Is that why his vehicle, the one he rented, had 185 miles on it because maybe he drove her out to a secluded location and buried her? The thing is, nobody knows. Police, it sounds like, believe that he was partially responsible or fully responsible for whatever may have happened to Susan, but what that is still unclear. Susan has never been seen or heard from ever again. None of her information has ever been used, to get a job or rent a place. She wasn't found in any hospitals, police stations, nowhere. In all likelihood, she is deceased. It's just a matter of why it happened and where is she. Somebody somewhere out there, hopefully, has got to know the truth. Hopefully Terry isn't the only one who knew it, and perhaps that someone is you. If you have any information about the whereabouts of Susan Dawson, please call 639-625-4111 or 800-222-8477. If you know anything, please come forward. A woman goes missing and her child is left behind in her car. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Tracy Kelley. Viewer discretion is advised. Tracy Kelley was born on March 15, 1968, and she was born and raised in Montgomery, Alabama. Eventually, she fell in love with and married Greg Kelley, and a year or two into their marriage, they ended up having a daughter. By 1997, however, the marriage would end up in divorce, but it was an amicable divorce. So Tracy ends up moving back into her parents' home while she is getting back on her feet. She secures a job at a local dentist's office, and that was set to begin on April 27th, 1998. Unfortunately, though, she would never make it to her first day. April 26, 1998, Tracy and her young daughter get into their 1993 Geo Storm, and they're going to be running some errands. At some point that evening, they were seen pulling into a BP gas station, and CCTV footage would eventually show Tracy getting gas. Then they leave the gas station. Tracy would never be seen again. Early the following morning, the vehicle that she was in, the Geo Storm, was found. The car was still running. Keys were in the ignition. Tracy's purse was inside the vehicle, nothing stolen. And in the back seat, Tracy's daughter, her child. The child was alive and well. She was completely unharmed as far as anyone could tell. And that just made this such a chilling mystery, because what on earth transpired to create this scenario? The car was on Old Georgia Road, which was off of Highway 170. It was a pretty desolate location. It's believed that Tracy was supposed to be on her way back to her parents' home. I don't know if this was along that path, though. But there was no signs of Tracy whatsoever. The vehicle itself did not show any signs of foul play. There was no signs of a struggle, no blood, no hair ripped out, no broken glass. She was just gone. But obviously, she would not just leave her child like that. And so there is this immediate belief that she met with foul play. But what exactly it was is still unknown to this day. There has been no signs of her, no traces of her ever found. There were reportedly no witnesses. No one saw, no one heard a thing. The only real witness really was the child, but she was only 2 or 3 years old. She was reported missing pretty much right away. They conducted search after search. They had a whole bunch of volunteers help. They put up billboards, they passed out flyers, but they really have gotten virtually nothing, which is kind of insane because how does this happen? What led to this? I don't think they really got much from the gas station footage. I mean, just showed her putting gas into the car and then leaving. Not in any kind of distress, from what I understand. I know that in recent years, I think as recently as 2023, they had warrants to search certain properties, which they have conducted those searches, but there's been no new information. They have gone into the local bodies of water. They have searched thoroughly. But again, no sign of her. No witnesses have reported seeing her. She hasn't used her bank account. She hasn't used her social security number. Tracy was 30 years old. She was supposed to be starting a new job literally the next day. She loved her daughter more than anything on this earth, and there is just no way possible that she would just pick up and leave her child, especially in that particular way. And she was excited for her new job. It was going to pay her well. So obviously they have to believe that foul play must have taken place. But what is that? Someone somewhere out there has got to know the truth about what happened to Tracy Kelley that day. Perhaps that someone is you. If you have any information on the whereabouts of Tracy Kelley, please call 334-676-7870 or 334-215-7867. You can report information anonymously. If you know anything, please come forward. They were left for dead in this shed for a couple $100. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Vera and Floyd Hill. Viewer discretion is advised. Unfortunately, I do not have any photos of the victims. But in this house lived 87-year-old Floyd Hill and his 72-year-old wife, Vera. Vera had been experiencing a lot of medical issues. And Floyd, who had been married to Vera for decades, was her caretaker. They were a very quiet, unassuming, well-loved couple. They had children and grandkids. And what would end up happening to them was an absolute nightmare. Their kids had not heard from them all day long, and that was on June 24th, 2004. They would be in contact with their parents literally all the time throughout the day. So they thought it was very concerning and strange that suddenly they weren't picking up. And this was in Eugene, Alabama. Am I saying that right? But police there would end up going to the home of the Hills. When they arrived, nobody answered the door, but all signs showed that the couple was home, and that's when they would end up walking back towards this shed. When they removed the padlock on it and opened the door, they found Floyd and Vera Hill. Floyd Hill would be pronounced dead at the scene. Vera Hill was unbelievably still alive. They had both very clearly been bludgeoned over their heads and stabbed. Vera was rushed to the hospital where she would essentially be on life support for a couple of months. She never regained really any consciousness to tell people what happened, but she would end up succumbing to her injuries and passing away. According to witnesses, they saw a white car that looked something like this that had been kind of driving up and down the road that day, and they recognized it as to belonging to someone who lived in the neighborhood. And that was to a man named Jamie Mills. When police go to Jamie's property, they find stolen property from the Hills home in his possession. They find bloody clothing. They find weapons. And police had reason to believe that Jamie's wife, Joanne Mills, was also involved. So they would talk to her, and she would almost immediately flip on her husband. So the night prior, she would tell police that her and her husband had done a lot of drugs. They did meth. And they had been kind of cruising the neighborhood within a few hours. And they stumbled across the Hills home. And what they did was they convinced Floyd and Vera to let them inside to use their phone. And they ended up separating the couple. Joanne would take Vera outside while Jamie stayed inside with Floyd. Jamie would then bludgeon Floyd over his head. He used a ball-peen hammer, a machete, and a tire tool. They then did the same thing to Vera. They then stole some property and about $140 from the house that Vera and Floyd Hill would make doing yard sales. They did these all the time. These two individuals were caught within a day of the murders. They were both arrested and charged with the murders. Because Joanne agreed to testify against her husband and turn state's evidence against him, she was allowed to basically take a plea deal. She pled guilty to lesser charges and was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, but with the possibility of parole. And her first parole option will be in 2027. Jamie Mills, not so lucky. Along with the damning evidence from his own wife, plus the bloody clothing with Vera and Floyd's blood on it, with the stolen items found in his possession, with his car being seen in the neighborhood, the evidence against him was staggering. He was convicted and sentenced to death. On May 30th, 2024, so less than a year ago, 50-year-old Jamie Ray Mills was strapped to the table and he was executed by lethal injection. And the world is a better place. Her murder was captured on camera, which would help lead to finding her killer. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Wanda Mason. Viewer discretion is advised. At the time of this case, Wanda Mason was a 48-year-old mother to 3, and she also had a couple grandkids. She is pictured here with her son, and she was nothing but a loving and supportive mom. The family may have never really been wealthy, but she did everything in her power to make sure that her family was well taken care of. That included the family kind of bouncing around from state to state before she finally found her footing in Lansing, Michigan. To make ends meet, she would get a secondary job here at this convenience store, which when she was hired was not a 24-hour store, but about a year or so into her working there, the owner of the place decided to turn it back into 24 hours. And Wanda Mason would volunteer to take the very first overnight shift. Before that happened, the owner installed security cameras in the store, well, one camera, facing towards, from the back of the store, facing towards the front counter, which would capture the front entrance where people would come and go. At 4:18 a.m. on October 10th, 1998, a group of customers comes into the convenience store. This is the actual footage, and they're going there to buy gas. But when they get in there, they don't find anyone working. When they walk around the counter, they find the employee on the ground. Wanda Mason was back here, and she had been shot. She had a very weak pulse, and so they called an ambulance, but by the time they arrived, Wanda would be pronounced deceased. At 4:19 a.m., after this group had called 911, another man walks into the store, and he immediately, once he sees what happened, is just immediately under a lot of distress. Because this right here is Donnie Warren, Wanda Mason's son. This is from actual news footage. He has just lost it outside the store for obvious reasons. But a lot of people were kind of confused by how he got there so quickly. And a lot of suspicion actually fell on him from the get-go. And he was accused of doing this. But they needed to prove that first. And in that process, they would be able to rule him out. While looking at the footage, which was really grainy, choppy, unstable footage, at 3:49 a.m., they can see here a car pulls up to the store. Less than 30 seconds later, this man walks into the store. He kind of walks around it. He doesn't buy anything, but he then leaves at 3:50 a.m. And actually, you can see Wanda right here in the corner. So it's believed that this man had gone in there to case the joint. 10 minutes later, at 3:59 a.m., a person walks into the store wearing the same black coat the individual was wearing previously, but this time the hoodie is pulled up over his head. Then you can see this individual forcing Wanda at gunpoint to walk towards the front counter. 3 seconds after 4 o'clock in the morning, you can see Wanda standing right here after she's already given the individual cash, and the suspect is here in the corner. And in the video footage, you can see him lift the gun, point it right at her head, and he pulls the trigger, point blank range, and he shoots her dead. The man is then seen running out of the store, and you can see him putting the gun into his jacket. There really wasn't much evidence left behind at the crime scene, like no fingerprints or DNA from the suspect. All they really had was the image of the man. So they would bring this to some forensic artists who would come up with a composite drawing based on the image. This is the image they came up with. They put this all over the news. Once they did, they got tips about who this man was. The ex-girlfriend of a man named Ronald Leon Allen would call in to state that she believes that the man in the footage was him. And if you line up his photo with the composite drawing, it's pretty damn accurate. But they needed to make sure. So what they did was they took these little height charts right here, they put it near the counter, then they put one at the door, and they kind of viewed people as they went in and out of the store. And they were able to determine that the suspect was about 5'3". Ronald Allen was 5'3". So he was the right height, and he looked identical to the suspect. He does willingly take a lie detector test, which he fails, but that doesn't always mean anything. And they took the footage and they brought it to like NASA and like government agencies to clear up the images. And so this is a clear image they came up with. They then took a mugshot of Ronald and overlaid it over the image on the CCTV footage. And they had him take a picture from like the right angle to line up with this person's face. And then they did the whole like back and forth superimposing thing, and it was an identical match. Furthermore, they found out that he drove this car, which based on the footage of the car here, they determined it was the same car in the footage. Ronald's cousin was going through some of Ronald's belongings, and he found hidden in this like big speaker setup, he found a gun. And so the cousin turns the gun into police. When they test fire that gun, based on the bullets that were found in Wanda Mason, it was determined that that gun was the murder weapon. That was the gun that shot and killed Wanda. So he is arrested and he's charged with Wanda Mason's murder. He goes on trial. The evidence against him is, despite it not being physical evidence like blood or fingerprints or anything, but the CCTV footage, the gun itself, the car, it was still pretty overwhelmingly against him. And the jury agreed and they found him guilty and they sentenced him to life in prison without parole. And Wanda Mason, who was working her first overnight shift just to take care of her family, who was savagely murdered for a few bucks, she would end up getting the justice she rightfully deserved. A loving father of 5 is found shot to death on this road, and his murder remains unsolved. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Warren Beaulieu. Viewer discretion is advised. At the time of this case, Warren Beaulieu was engaged to Hope Badeau, and they were from the Bemidji, Minnesota area. Hope described Warren as the absolute love of her life. They were very excited to have a future together. Warren was also a father to 5 daughters, and he loved his children more than anything. They were his entire life. He was a type of person who would give you the shirt off of his back to help a stranger. He just loved being outdoors. He loved playing guitar. He was just a solid guy. He was really well liked. But then one day, suddenly someone took him away from the world. And the question still remains, why? It happened on the 11,000 block of Chalk Cherry Drive on Long Lake Drive Northeast. I guess this was technically in the Turtle River Township area. 29-year-old Warren would call police. He called 911 himself because he has just been shot. Nobody was there to call 911 for him. Nobody was there to help him. By the time police arrive at the scene, it's about 3:25 p.m. on September 5th, 2021, and it was too late. Warren would be pronounced deceased, and he was found shot to death in his car. This was reportedly near a friend's house just outside of Bemidji, Minnesota. However, police have not released much information with regards to the details they have. Police have stated that there have been no witnesses who would come forward to state they saw the crime happen. However, they have said there were people in that area who may have heard something, but they're not coming forward. No one has come forward to state what they know. If there are people who do know exactly how this occurred and why, they're staying silent. I don't know if they have much physical evidence, like I don't know if they have fingerprints or any DNA. I don't know if they have the murder weapon. Again, they seem to be keeping a lot kind of close to the chest on this one, which sometimes they do it helps them, find out who the actual killer is, because they may slip and say something that nobody should know. I don't know if that's the reason why they haven't released much, though. I'm not sure. But somebody somewhere out there has got to know who did this. 5 daughters are growing up now without a father. And a woman is without the love of her life forever. And whoever did this to them needs to be locked up. If you know something, say something. You can be anonymous. You don't have to say who you are. All you have to say is what you know. It isn't fair that his family has to deal with this and not know why this happened and who did it. So if you have any information on the murder of Warren Beaulieu, please call 218-333-9111 or 1-800-222-8477.